The emergency room had seen plenty of chaos, but nothing like this. A wounded SEAL colonel, blood soaking through his tactical vest, monitors screaming, grabbed the wrist of the nurse everyone had been trying to fire for 3 weeks. His grip was iron. His eyes, burning with recognition, locked onto her face like he was seeing a ghost rise from the dead. The room went still. Then he forced his broken body upright, against every monitor, against every instinct, and raised a trembling hand in a full military salute, not to the chief surgeon standing 2 feet away, to her. The nurse nobody wanted. Before we go any further, if you've never been to this channel before, hit that subscribe button right now, because we tell stories here that will wreck you in the best possible way. Smash that like button if you want more, and drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's begin. The charge nurse position at Westhaven Regional Medical Center had been open for 11 days when Dr. Marcus Vell first noticed the new hire standing outside Trauma Bay 3, holding a saline bag like she wasn't sure which end was up. He watched her for a moment from across the nurses' station. This small woman in scrubs that were at least a size too big, hair pulled back in a way that looked less deliberate than exhausted, moving with a kind of careful hesitation that immediately read as someone who didn't belong. She was reading the room the way a person reads a room they've never been in and aren't sure they were invited to. Her hands, when she finally hung the bag, trembled enough that the tubing rattled against the IV pole. Dr. Vell looked at the charge nurse to his left, a veteran named Rosario Timmons, who had been at Westhaven for 14 years and kept score on everything. "Who's that?" he asked. Rosario didn't look up from her keyboard. "New hire. Started Monday. Name's Nora Voss." "Where'd she come from?" "Some rural clinic up near the state line, I think. Before that, I don't know. Her file's thin." Dr. Vell watched Nora Voss check the drip rate twice, then check it a third time. He made a sound in the back of his throat that wasn't quite a laugh. "How long before she washes out?" Rosario finally glanced up. She looked at Nora, then back at her screen. "I give her 2 weeks. Maybe 3, if she's stubborn." Westhaven Regional sat in the mid-sized city of Dorland, Colorado. Not large enough to feel like a real metropolitan hospital, not small enough to be forgiven for mediocrity. It was a level 1 trauma center that took pride in that designation and made sure everyone knew it, from the marble inlaid lobby to the framed commendations on the administrative floor. The trauma department ran on the reputation of its surgeons, and no one at Westhaven wore that reputation more visibly than Dr. Marcus Vell. He had trained at Johns Hopkins. He had published 31 peer-reviewed studies. He had been profiled in a regional medicine quarterly under the headline, "The Man Who Rewrote Trauma Protocol." He was, by most accounts, exceptional at his job. He was also the kind of man who had never once questioned whether the confidence that made him exceptional had curdled, somewhere along the way, into something meaner. By Nora Voss's 4th day, she had already been the subject of 2 conversations she wasn't supposed to hear. The first happened in the break room when Dr. Vell was talking to the second-year resident, a sharp young man named Drew Packard, who had a bad habit of laughing at things he didn't find funny in order to seem agreeable. "She retaped a wound dressing this morning," Vell said, pouring his coffee without looking up. "Took her 4 minutes." "4 minutes, Drew. My med students move faster than that." "Maybe she's just careful," Drew said, immediately regretting it. Vell looked at him. "There's careful and there's slow. Slow gets people killed in this department. I don't babysit. If she can't keep pace by the end of the month, I'm going to the board and recommending they reassign her to outpatient." The second conversation was worse because it happened at the nurses' station in front of 3 other staff members, and Nora was around the corner, close enough to hear every word, far enough that Vell could have, if pressed, claimed he didn't know she was there. "She second-guessed an IV order this morning," he said, loudly enough. "Came and asked me to confirm a dosage that was clearly labeled. Either she can't read or she doesn't trust herself. Either way, it's a problem." One of the other nurses, a woman named Bet, who had been at Westhaven longer than Rosario and had seen enough to know when something was wrong, said carefully, "Some people take time to adjust to a new system." Vell picked up his tablet. "We don't have time for adjustment. We have a level 1 designation to protect." He walked away. Bet looked at the corner where Nora had been standing. Nora was gone. What no one at Westhaven saw, because Nora Voss was very, very good at making sure they didn't, were the small things she did that didn't make sense for someone who supposedly didn't belong. The way she scanned a room when she entered it, not casually, not the way a nervous person checks for exits, but methodically, left to right, high to low, cataloging. The way she stood with her back to the wall in the break room, always facing the door. The way during a minor trauma intake on her 5th day, she clocked a patient's respiratory pattern before the attending did, and quietly said nothing, waiting to see if anyone else noticed. And when no one did, she documented it and flagged it on the chart with a note that the attending dismissed, and then, 40 minutes later, quietly acted on without acknowledging where the observation came from. Nora noticed him not acknowledging it. She noted that too. Her hands shook. That part was real. It wasn't nerves, not exactly. It was something that had never fully resolved from a different time, a different life. Cold nights and pressure she didn't talk about, and a body that had decided it would carry the evidence of what it had been through, whether she liked it or not. She managed it. She had learned to manage it. But it looked, to the untrained eye, like fear. At Westhaven, fear was weakness, and weakness was unwelcome. She had known that going in. She had taken the job anyway, because Dorland was far from anything she'd known before, and far was what she needed. The apartment she rented was small and faced north, so it didn't get much light. She kept it bare. A cot-style bed, a kitchen table, a second-hand chair. On the closet shelf, behind 2 folded blankets, there was a locked metal box that she never opened at home. She had carried it from her previous address and the address before that, and she would carry it to the next one. It was the only thing she owned that had any weight to it, and not because of what was inside. The medals, the citation papers, the photograph taken in a desert she didn't name out loud anymore. It had weight because of what putting it in a box and closing the lid had cost her. She had been someone else before Nora Voss. She had been someone with a rank and a call sign and a record that, if you could find it, and most people couldn't, because most of it was classified or deliberately buried, would have stopped every person at Westhaven dead in their tracks. But she wasn't that person anymore. She had chosen not to be, and she was managing. Until the Tuesday in her 3rd week, when Dr. Vell stopped managing her quietly and went public. It happened during morning rounds, the full rotation, 6 doctors, 4 residents, a cluster of nurses moving through the floor in that loose formation that hospitals use to simultaneously teach and perform authority. Nora was at the edge of the group, holding her tablet, staying back the way she had trained herself to stay back, when Vell stopped outside a patient room and turned. "Voss," he said. She looked up. "Walk me through the overnight notes on this patient, bed 12. She had read the notes. She had actually written 2 of them herself during a shift handoff, flagging a change in urine output that suggested early fluid imbalance. She pulled up the chart, began to speak clearly and without hesitation. And Vell cut her off after 12 seconds. "That's the transcription," he said. "I can read. Tell me what you observed, what you actually saw." The output change suggested. He said the word the way you might repeat back something a child had said that wasn't quite right. "You're a nurse, Voss, not a diagnostician. Your job is to document and report, not to suggest." He looked at the residents. This is the problem with people who come from smaller facilities. They develop habits that don't translate. The resident said nothing. Drew Packard looked at his shoes. Nora said nothing either. She let it go, because letting it go was the right tactical choice, and she had been making tactical choices for longer than Marcus Vell had been practicing medicine. But something shifted in her that morning, something small and quiet, the way a hairline fracture shifts in a wall before anyone notices the crack. She had told herself she would endure the adjustment period. She had told herself that small-scale humiliation was manageable. She had told herself a lot of things. She was starting to wonder if she had told herself too many. The week that followed was a study in the particular cruelty of institutional dismissal, the kind that never quite crosses a line, that accumulates in small doses, that is always just about professionalism and standards rather than anything personal. Nora's charting was audited. Her medication administration timing was flagged and reviewed. She was pulled from a trauma intake, politely, by the charge nurse, with a perfectly professional explanation, and reassigned to a lower acuity floor that everyone understood was a soft emotion. She went. She did the work. She made no complaints. Bet found her in the supply room on a Thursday afternoon, organizing IV kits in a manner that was technically beyond the scope of what she'd been asked to do, and said without preamble, "You know this isn't about your competence." Nora didn't look up. "I know. He does this. Not always this bad, but he picks someone." "I know." Bet watched her for a moment. "You're not going to say anything? File a grievance?" "No." "Why not?" Nora finally looked up. Her expression was level, not defeated, just measured, in a way that Bet found difficult to read. "Because it would make things worse and take energy I'd rather spend on other things." "That's very—" Bet started, then stopped. "Pragmatic." "Yes." Bet stood there a moment longer. Then she left, and Nora went back to the IV kits, and that was that. What happened 9 days later was not something anyone could have prepared for. It started as a sound. Rotors, loud and low, the kind of heavy thrum that doesn't belong over a hospital unless something has gone very wrong. Nora was at the nurse's station on the second floor when the ceiling vibrated slightly, and Rosario's radio squawked, and the overhead page fired. Trauma activation, rooftop, all available trauma staff, stat. The elevator was too slow. Everyone took the stairs. By the time Nora reached the rooftop landing pad, the helicopter was already down. A military aircraft, dark and matte, not the standard medevac red and white, and that alone told her something before she registered anything else. The team moving the gurney off the bird was split between flight medics and men who were clearly not medics at all. They wore tactical gear without insignia. They moved with the kind of compressed efficiency that only came from training that had nothing to do with hospitals. One of them, a large man with a bandaged forearm, moving with the controlled tension of someone operating through serious pain, stepped forward as the trauma team converged. Blunt force and penetrating trauma, left chest. "He's got a tension pneumo developing. We've been watching the pressure differential for the last 20 minutes. He needs a surgeon who knows what they're looking at." Dr. Vell stepped to the gurney and took the chart handed to him by the flight medic. He scanned it. "I've got it." The man in tactical gear didn't move back the way civilian observers did. "He's Colonel Reed Harlan, Naval Special Warfare. His vitals have been—" "I understand." Vell was already moving, and the team moved with him, and the elevator was there, and they loaded in, and Nora was the last one through the doors, and almost didn't make it, but did. She stood in the corner of the elevator 2 feet from the gurney and looked at the man on it for the first time. He was big, the kind of big that had been earned over decades and still showed even when a body was shutting down. His face was gray-white under the fluorescent elevator light, jaw tight, eyes half open and unfocused in the way eyes went when pain was high enough and blood pressure low enough that consciousness became a negotiation. There was blood soaking through the emergency compression wrap on his left side. The field dressing was good. Someone had known what they were doing out there. But it had run out of time. Nora looked at the dressing, looked at his breathing. The shallow rise on the left, the slightly exaggerated compensatory effort on the right. Looked at the JVD. Jugular venous distension. Subtle, but present. The neck veins just slightly too full. She looked at the oxygen sat reading on the portable monitor. 89% and dropping. She looked at Vell. He was reviewing the chart, making notes, moving with confidence. He hadn't looked at the patient's neck yet. The elevator doors opened and they were moving again, fast, down the corridor, into Trauma Bay 1, which was already prepped. Nurses in position, the energy in the room, that particular high-frequency current that meant everyone understood the stakes and was running on adrenaline and training. "Let's get a chest x-ray," and Vell began. "There's no time for a chest x-ray." Nora said it before she could decide whether to. The room stopped. Not physically. Hands kept moving, monitors kept beeping, the respiratory tech kept adjusting. But the attention in the room pivoted like a compass needle finding north. Vell turned to look at her. His expression was the particular kind of still that came before something sharp. "I'm sorry?" His SAT is at 86. She hadn't taken her eyes off the patient. "The JVD is progressing. His trachea is going to start deviating if it hasn't already. You're looking at a tension pneumothorax. An X-ray takes time he doesn't have." Vell's voice was controlled. "Nurse Voss, I appreciate the input, but left side." She moved to the gurney, and something in the way she moved made people step back without being asked. Not because she was aggressive, but because there was a quality to her movement that had changed. The tremor in her hands was gone. It had simply stopped, the way a shaking line goes still before a storm breaks, and she moved with a certainty that was different from anything the staff at Westhaven had seen from her. He's been compensating for at least 20 minutes based on the field report. If you run an X-ray first and you're wrong about the timeline, you've already lost him. And if you're wrong about the diagnosis? Vel asked. She looked at him. I'm not. The man in tactical gear, who had ridden the elevator down and was standing just outside the bay doors, said quietly. She's right. That's exactly what our field medic flagged. Vel looked between them. The monitor alarm shifted tones, the particular sound that meant SAT had dropped below 85. Talk me through your proposed intervention, Vel said. His voice had changed, not conceding, but something in it had recalibrated, the way a structure shifts when it detects a load it didn't expect. Needle decompression, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, left side. Now. Then we reassess for chest tube placement. You want to perform? I want you to perform it, right now, unless you want me to. She said it plainly, without challenge in her voice, just the flatness of someone stating available options. I've done it in worse conditions than this. The room was very quiet. Vel picked up the needle. He found the landmark. He was good at what he did. That was never the question. And when he inserted the needle, the rush of air was immediate and audible, and the monitors began within 30 seconds to shift. Oxygen SAT climbed. 87, 89, 91. The tension left the colonel's face in stages, like something unlocking. Vel stood back, looked at the monitors, looked at Nora. She was already stepping back into her corner position, her hands folded, her posture returned to the careful, unremarkable stillness she usually wore like a coat. The tremor was back, or maybe it had never fully left, and she had just moved through it for those 2 minutes the way she had learned to move through everything else. Chest tube next, she said, to no one in particular. Nobody contradicted her. The procedure took another 40 minutes. Nora assisted without being asked and without overstepping, handing instruments, monitoring vitals, documenting with the clean speed of someone who had never actually been slow, just careful in a different context. The staff around her worked alongside her with the slightly dazed quality of people recalibrating what they thought they knew. Colonel Reed Harlan stabilized. His oxygen SAT settled at 97%. His blood pressure evened out. His color came back in the slow way color came back, gray to ash to something human. The team began to wind down the acute phase, moving into post-stabilization protocol, and the man in tactical gear came to the bay door and looked through the window. Nora saw him exhale, a long, controlled release that said relief more clearly than words. She stepped out into the corridor. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then, that was good work. He's going to need the chest tube monitored carefully. The field compression shifted some tissue. Whoever's on overnight needs to know what to watch. I'll tell them. He paused. What's your name? Before she could answer, Dr. Vel came through the bay door. He looked at the man, then at Nora, and something in his expression had the quality of someone who had just been reminded of a fact they had been trying to dismiss. We need to debrief on protocol, Vel said, to Nora specifically. She looked at him. What you did in there, the intervention, the unsanctioned. The patient is alive, she said. The patient is alive, and we'll discuss what that means in terms of your conduct. This isn't a military field unit. There are standards. There are, she agreed. He waited for more. She didn't give him more. That flatness again. Not defiance. Just the absence of the deference he had come to expect. My office, he said. Tomorrow morning. Fine. He went back into the bay. The man in tactical gear was still watching her. Friendly guy, he said quietly. She almost smiled. Almost. He's fine. He'll be fine. But he's going to try to make your life difficult. He already has been. She glanced back at the bay. It doesn't matter. The man studied her for a moment, just long enough that she felt it, the quality of attention that went past polite curiosity into something more considered, like recognition searching for a name. She walked away before he found it. The overnight shift passed without incident, and Nora went home in the early gray of morning and sat in the bare apartment and did not sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water she didn't drink and listened to the building settle and thought about the look on Vel's face when the monitors had turned. The moment when his confidence had encountered something it couldn't immediately classify. She was not proud of herself for having been necessary. She did not feel vindicated. She felt tired and a little exposed, and she knew, with the practical clarity of someone who had spent a long time reading rooms and reading situations, that what had happened in Trauma Bay 1 would not make things easier. It would make them harder. Because people like Marcus Vell did not respond to being wrong by becoming grateful. They responded to it by becoming more dangerous. She had made herself visible. That was the thing she had been most careful not to do. She looked at the closet. She did not open it. She sat at the table until the light changed, then she changed her scrubs and went back. Colonel Harlan was awake by mid-morning, groggy, medicated, but tracking. The nursing staff had been in twice. Nora was not assigned to his care directly, but she walked the floor. And when she passed his room the second time, the door was partly open, and she heard him speak. His voice was rough, barely above a murmur, talking to one of the men in tactical gear who had stayed, a younger one, sitting in the corner chair with the stillness of someone trained to be quiet. "Who ran the decompression call?" Harlan asked. "Surgeon," the young man said, but a nurse caught it, pushed him to act. A pause. "What was her name?" "I don't know. Small, brown hair, steady hands under pressure." Another pause, longer. "What did she look like?" "Medium height, scar on her left forearm, looked old. She walked a little off." Nora was already past the door. She did not slow down. She kept walking to the supply room at the end of the corridor and stood inside it for a moment with her back against the closed door and focused on breathing the way she had been taught to focus. 4 counts in, hold 4, 4 out, until the thing that had moved through her chest settled back down into the place she kept it. He wouldn't remember. It had been years, and she had changed, and people looked different when they were out of context, out of theater, out of uniform. He wouldn't remember. She was still telling herself that when she was called to the nursing supervisor's office at noon and told, very professionally and with several layers of bureaucratic language that made it sound like something other than what it was, that she would be placed on administrative review pending an evaluation of her conduct during the previous day's trauma activation. The supervisor, a woman named Patricia Grundle, who had the particular energy of someone who had long ago learned to deliver bad news with a face that gave nothing away, slid a form across the desk. "It's not a termination," Grundle said. "It's a review, standard process." "Initiated by Dr. Vell?" A pause. "The review is initiated by the department." "Right." Nora looked at the form. "What do I need to sign?" "You don't have to sign anything today. This is informational. The review panel will convene in, how long do I continue working during the review? You're not suspended. You continue your duties as assigned." "As assigned," Nora repeated, meaning the lower acuity floor, meaning away from trauma. "Understood." She signed what needed signing and left the office and went back to work. And the afternoon was long and unremarkable, and she focused on the patients in front of her. An elderly man with a wound infection that had been undertreated for 2 days. A teenager with a migraine that was almost certainly being masking a more complicated presentation. A woman in her 40s who kept trying to leave AMA and needed to be talked through why that was a poor choice, with enough patience and enough honesty that she eventually, grudgingly, stayed. Nora was good with people who were frightened and trying not to show it. She understood that particular performance. At the end of the shift, she was in the corridor outside the elevator when she heard the footsteps behind her and turned. Colonel Reed Harlan was standing in the hallway in a hospital gown, one hand on the IV pole he was using as a makeshift crutch, the other arm pressed to his left side. He was upright by sheer determination and clearly had no business being upright. His color was better than it had been, but still not good, and his eyes, clear now, tracking, were fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach go very quiet. "I told them I needed the bathroom," he said. His voice was rough but steady. "They don't know I walked the corridor." She started toward him. "You need to get back in." "I know you," he said. She stopped. "I've been trying to place you all day. The walk, the way you stood in the corner." He paused, breathing carefully. "And someone told me about the scar." The corridor was empty. The elevator was 20 feet away. "You're confused," she said, keeping her voice level. "You were in significant distress yesterday, and the medications. My medications are perfectly clear." He looked at her. "Voss is not your name." She said nothing. "Your name—" He stopped, swallowed. The effort of standing was costing him, and he knew it and was spending it anyway. There was a medevac 6 years ago in the Makar Valley. 4 of my operators were down. The site was compromised. The extraction team that came in, he stopped again. There was a medic. She performed field surgery under fire for 2 hours. When the second extraction bird came in, she put my men on it first and went back to cover the perimeter. He held her gaze. We were told she didn't make it out. The elevator light above the doors counted down through the floors. Nora Voss stood in the empty corridor and looked at the man who shouldn't have been standing and shouldn't have been talking and shouldn't have been looking at her the way he was looking at her, and she felt the hairline fracture from 2 weeks ago become something larger and more real. Colonel Harlan, she said, you need to go back to your room. Tell me I'm wrong, he said. She picked up his IV pole with one hand, took his arm with the other, gently, precisely, the way she had learned to do it when bodies were fragile, and began walking him back toward his room. He let her, but he didn't look away. And she didn't answer him. And she didn't answer him. She got him back to the room without incident, which was the best that could be said for it. The young operator in the corner chair stood up the moment they came through the door, his face cycling through surprise and relief, and something that looked like the particular irritation of someone who had been responsible for a patient who had just done something inadvisable. Colonel, I'm fine, Harlan said, which was not entirely true, but true enough that arguing with it would have been unproductive. Nora helped him back to the bed with the same careful efficiency she'd used in the corridor, adjusting the IV line, checking the chest tube site without being asked, noting the output in the drainage collection with the quick mental calculation of someone who had been doing this long enough that the numbers arranged themselves into meaning before she consciously processed them. Stable. Still holding. She straightened. Harlan was watching her. He hadn't stopped watching her since the corridor, and the quality of that attention was different from the way patients usually watch nurses. The anxious tracking of someone monitoring their own medical situation, or the passive unfocus of someone medicated and fading. He was watching her the way a man watches something he has categorized but not yet named, turning it over, checking angles. You should sleep, she said. Probably. Your drainage output is good. The attending will round in a few hours. Voss? She looked at him. I'm not confused, he said quietly, and I'm not going to say anything. I needed to know. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she said, Get some rest, Colonel, and left the room. And this time, she didn't look back. The walk to the elevator was longer than it had been before. She pressed the button and waited. And while she waited, she looked at her left hand, which was trembling in the specific way it trembled when she was holding something in instead of down, a distinction she had learned to make after years of managing both. The box in the closet at home, the locked thing. She thought about it the way she sometimes thought about old injuries, not with longing, not with grief exactly, just with the neutral acknowledgement that it was there and had always been there and would continue to be there regardless of what she did about it. She thought about the Makar Valley. She stopped thinking about the Makar Valley. The elevator came, and she got in, and by the time the doors opened on the lower floor, she had put her face back together well enough that nobody who looked at her would have seen anything wrong. That was a skill, too, just a different kind. The administrative review meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning at 9, which gave Nora 2 more days of the lower acuity floor, and 2 more evenings in the bare apartment and 2 nights of the particular non-sleep she had gotten good at. The horizontal stillness that stood in for rest without quite delivering it. She ate. She ran 4 miles each morning on a route that took her past a park and a shuttered diner and a stretch of industrial fencing she had memorized without meaning to. She went to work, and she did the work, and she said little and noticed everything. On Wednesday afternoon, Bet found her again. This time, it was in the corridor outside the medication room, and Bet's expression had an urgency to it that she was visibly trying to keep from showing, which meant she had information and hadn't decided what to do with it. I heard something, Bet said, without preamble. Nora waited. Vel talked to Grundle again this morning, before rounds. Bet glanced down the corridor, checked both directions out of the kind of reflex that people developed when they'd worked long enough in an institution where information moved dangerously. I wasn't supposed to hear it, but the break room wall is thin, and he wasn't being quiet. He's not just pushing for the review. He's building a file. He's been going back through every chart you've touched since you started and flagging anything he can frame as a deviation. From protocol, Nora said. From his version of protocol, which is not always... Bet stopped. Look, he's done this before. Not to this degree, but there was a resident 2 years ago. Third year. Very good. Better than he wanted to admit. She pushed back on a medication decision once, publicly, and by the end of 6 months she'd been transferred out to a community hospital, and her recommendation letters were, let's say they were not helpful. Nora looked at her carefully. Why are you telling me this? Bet seemed to consider the question. It was a fair one. They weren't friends. Not really. Not in the way that word usually meant. They were colleagues in the loose sense of people who shared space and occasional honesty, and honesty wasn't always safe, and Bet knew that. Because you were right in that trauma bay, she said finally, and he knows you were right, and that's exactly why he's doing this. She paused. And because I'm tired. I have been here 14 years and I'm tired of watching this happen and saying nothing. Nora nodded slowly. Okay. Okay. Thank you, genuinely. She looked at Bet steadily. Don't put yourself in his crosshairs over this. I mean that. Bet made a sound that was mostly exhale. What are you going to do? Go to my review tomorrow and see what he's built. That's it? That's it for now. She almost said something else, then didn't. Go home tonight, Bet. Sleep. Bet left. Nora stood in the corridor for a moment, alone, and let herself think. The thing about people like Marcus Vell was that they were rarely incompetent. That was the part that made them genuinely dangerous, rather than just annoying. He was a skilled surgeon, probably an excellent one on the days when his ego wasn't the primary variable in the room. His instinct to protect his authority came from a place that had, at some point in the past, probably been functional. The kind of professional defensiveness that served a purpose in a high-stakes environment, and then metastasized into something that served only itself. She had met this type before, not in hospitals. In other buildings, other institutions, where rank meant something and people inside it sometimes forgot that rank was a tool, not an identity. The difference was that in those other places, when someone like Vell made a call that cost something, the consequences were usually harder to paper over. Here, the paperwork was the point. She went home. She did not open the closet. She ate something she didn't taste and sat at the kitchen table and read the review documentation that had been emailed to her that afternoon. 12 pages of flagged chart entries, each with a note from Vell that framed her clinical observations as overreach, her documentation as protocol deviation, her intervention in the trauma bay as unauthorized independent action placing patient and staff at risk. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time more slowly, the way she used to read mission briefings, looking not for what was there, but for what the structure of it revealed about the person who had written it. Vell had been thorough. He had been thorough in the specific way of someone who was frightened and covering it with volume. The sheer density of the file, 12 pages for 3 weeks of nursing, said more than any single entry did. He was afraid of what she represented. Not her specifically. Not yet. He didn't know who she was yet. He was afraid of the fact that she had been right when he hadn't been, and that a room full of people had seen it. She closed the document. She slept 4 hours. It felt like 2. The review convened in a conference room on the administrative floor, a room that tried to be neutral through beige paint and a round table and failed because the 4 people sitting on the other side of it and the 1 chair waiting for Nora on this side made the geometry of the situation clear enough without any help from the color scheme. Grundle was there, and 2 people from hospital administration that Nora recognized by face but not name, and Dr. Vell. And unexpectedly, a man she had not seen before, older, in civilian clothes, with the particular posture of someone whose default was a different kind of room than this one. She registered him and filed him and took her seat. "Thank you for coming, Ms. Voss," Grundle began. "Nurse Voss," Nora said pleasantly. A small pause. "Of course. Nurse Voss." Grundle had a folder in front of her. "You've received the documentation pertaining to this review." "I have." "Then I'll let Dr. Vell walk us through the department's concerns." Vell had a copy of the same 12-page document, printed and tabbed. He was dressed well, the way he always was, and he carried the room with the practiced ease of someone who had presented in rooms like this before and knew how to make the space work for him. He began with the chart entries, the documentation flags, the medication timing, the instances he had cataloged as evidence of pattern deviation, and he was measured about it. Not aggressive, almost regretful, which was the more effective version. My concern, he said, is not any single incident, it's the accumulation. A nurse who second-guesses orders, documents interpretations outside her scope, and ultimately performs, or attempts to perform, independent clinical intervention in a trauma setting without physician authorization. He set the document down. The Trauma Bay incident in particular is what brings this to the level it's at. Regardless of the outcome, the conduct was a breach. Nora waited to see if he was done. He was. "May I respond?" she asked, looking at Grundle. "Of course." She did not have notes. She did not have a folder. She looked at Vel and said, "The documentation flags you've listed, I'd like to address 3 specifically. The IV dosage confirmation on October 3rd. I asked Dr. Packard to confirm a dosage because the verbal order conflicted with what was in the chart. That's not second-guessing. That's error prevention. There's a protocol for it." She named the protocol number from memory. "The observation note on October 9th, which you flagged as a diagnostic overreach. I documented a change in urine output and flagged it for physician review. That is explicitly within nursing scope. If you review the chart, you'll see the attending acted on that observation 40 minutes after dismissing it. I didn't make a diagnosis. I made an observation and documented it correctly." Vel's expression had not changed. "And the trauma bay," she said. "I verbally communicated my clinical assessment to the attending physician. I named a diagnosis and recommended a treatment. The physician executed the treatment. That is a nurse functioning exactly as a trauma nurse is supposed to function in a high-acuity emergency." She paused. "If the concern is that I named the diagnosis before the physician did, then I'd invite a review of the timeline and the patient SAT readings at the point I spoke." One of the administrators shifted in their chair. Vel said, "You told me to stop. Your exact words were, 'Stop, you'll kill him.' In front of staff, in front of a patient whose SAT was dropping below 86 with an untreated tension pneumo." Her voice stayed level. "If I was wrong, I would apologize for that. I was not wrong." The room was quiet in a way that had texture to it. The man she didn't recognize, in the civilian clothes, had not said anything since she'd entered. He was looking at her with an attention that was different from the administrator's careful neutrality and different from Vel's controlled antagonism. It was the same quality of attention she had felt in the corridor with Harlan, and she didn't like it. Grundle was making a note. "Nurse Voss, the review panel will need time to deliberate. In the meantime, you'll continue in your current assignment and we'll be in touch within—" The door opened. Everyone turned. The young operator from Harlan's room was standing in the doorway. He looked at the room with the efficient scan of someone assessing a situation, landed on Nora, and said, "I'm sorry to interrupt. Colonel Harlan is requesting Nurse Voss, directly." Vel's expression finally moved. "This is an administrative review. It's not—" "The colonel is requesting her," the young man said again, with the polite immovability of someone who was not actually asking. "He asked me to say it was urgent." Grundle looked at Nora. Nora looked at Grundle. "I'll return," Nora said, "if that's acceptable." It was not entirely acceptable, and everyone in the room knew it, and the review was suspended for 30 minutes with an edge of irritation that was specifically directed at the door the young operator had left open when he stepped aside to let Nora through. She followed him down the corridor in silence. "He really is requesting you," the young man said, after they'd turned the corner. "This isn't a rescue operation." "I know. His name's Garrett, by the way. Petty Officer Garrett Lowe." He glanced at her. "He's been awake most of the night. Wouldn't tell us why." She had a reasonable idea why, but said nothing. Harlan was sitting up when she entered the room. He'd been given the option of a chair by the window and had taken it, which told her he was feeling better in the way patients who were feeling better immediately tried to demonstrate, whether or not that was wise. His color was better. His breathing was even. The chest tube was still in place and would be for at least another day, and the IV pole was next to the chair, and he looked overall like a man who was recovering at a rate that had more to do with willpower than biology. He looked at her when she came in. "Garrett says I pulled you out of something," he said. "An administrative meeting. About the trauma bay. Among other things." He exhaled. "Vel." She didn't confirm or deny. She moved to check the chest tube drainage out of habit, noted the numbers, straightened. You had something you needed to say, Colonel. I've been thinking about Makar Valley since last night. He said it directly, the way he said everything. No preamble, no softening. About the report we were given afterward. They told us the extraction medic was killed during the second exfil. Friendly fire incident during the withdrawal. Her records were classified at the request of the unit she was embedded with. He paused. At the time, we accepted that because there was no reason not to. Nora was very still. I'm not asking you to confirm anything, he said. I want you to understand that. I'm not going to push on who you are or what you've built here, but I want to say one thing and then I'll leave it. She waited. What was done for my people in that valley? I've thought about it for 6 years. We tried to find out more and the door was shut every time. He looked at her steadily. If you're who I think you are, you should know that those 4 men are alive. All of them. One of them has 2 kids now. One of them teaches. One of them runs a search and rescue team out of Wyoming, and one of them, he stopped, cleared his throat. One of them keeps a photo in his wallet from a disposable camera he had in his kit bag. He doesn't know who took it. Blurry. Dark. But it's the only record he has from that night. Nora looked at the wall past his shoulder. I'm not going to say anything to the doctors, he said, or to administration. You have my word on that. She looked at him then. Looked at him for a long moment. Get some sleep, Colonel. You're still in recovery. She left before he could say anything else, and she made it to the corridor and the door closed behind her, and she stood with her back against the wall outside his room, with her eyes on the ceiling and her arms folded across her chest, and she stayed like that for probably 30 seconds, which was 28 seconds longer than she usually allowed herself for anything. Then she went back to the administrative review. The room had the awkward, slightly resumed quality of a meeting that had been interrupted and hadn't quite settled back into its original shape. Grundle looked at her. Vel looked at her. The unknown man in civilian clothes looked at her with that same careful attention. She sat down. As I was saying, she said, I'd invite a timeline review. Vel set down whatever he'd been looking at while she was gone. Nurse Voss, I want to be direct with you. This department operates at a standard that requires... Dr. Vel, the man in civilian clothes, spoke for the first time. Vel turned. The man had a card on the table in front of him that he slid toward the center without standing up. I should have introduced myself at the start. I apologize for that. My name is Donald Faber. I'm with the Naval Health Systems Command Inspector General's office. We were notified of Colonel Harlan's admission and the circumstances of his treatment as a matter of standard protocol. He looked at Vel with an expression that was professionally pleasant in the way that a closed door is neutral. I've been sitting in on this review in an observational capacity. I hope that's been clear. It had not been clear. Not to anyone at the table, including Grundle, whose expression had shifted slightly. I have a few questions, Faber said, when you're done, if that's convenient. Questions about, Vel started. About the treatment Colonel Harlan received. He looked at his notepad. Specifically, the timeline of intervention in the trauma bay, the sequence of clinical decision-making, and the administrative actions taken in the 48 hours following. He picked up his pen. Please, continue. The review continued, but it did not continue in the same way it had been going. Vel was still precise, still measured, but something had shifted in the room's balance the way it shifts when a new weight is added to one side of a scale. Not dramatic, not announced, just a change in what level looked like. Grundle's questions became slightly more careful. The 2 administrators said less. Nora answered everything that was asked of her in the same clear, flat tone she'd been using since she sat down. And she did not look at Faber, and Faber did not look at her. And somehow that deliberate mutual avoidance was more charged than if they'd been watching each other all morning. When the formal portion concluded and Grundle indicated a recess for deliberation, Faber stood and said he'd be in the building for the rest of the day and was available if anyone had questions, and left with the particular ease of someone who understood that leaving a room was sometimes more effective than staying in it. Vel caught Nora in the corridor. She had known he would. He fell into step beside her with the body language of someone who wanted to have a private conversation but was in a public hallway and was managing the contradiction badly. His voice was low. That meeting was not what I expected. No, she agreed. Who is Faber? He told you who he is. You knew he was going to be there. She stopped walking and turned to face him, which made him stop too. Dr. Vell, I didn't know that man was in that room until I sat down. I don't know why he was there any more than you do. What I know is what I knew when I walked in, which is that the 12-page document you put together is a response to a trauma-based situation where the patient survived because the right intervention was made at the right time. That's what happened. That's what the record shows. She looked at him steadily. Whatever this review concludes, that record doesn't change. She walked away. He didn't follow. The afternoon was long. She moved through it carefully, doing the work that was in front of her, taking no shortcuts, leaving nothing undone. The lower acuity floor was not challenging in the way she was trained for, but the patients there were real and their needs were real, and she treated them that way, which was the only way she knew how to do it. Around 4 o'clock, Garrett Lowe appeared on the floor looking for her. She saw him before he saw her, which was habit, and waited until he found her. "Colonel's asking about discharge timeline, Shetta," he said. "That's a physician question." "I know. He also wanted me to tell you." Garrett stopped, looked slightly uncomfortable in the way someone looks when they're delivering a message they weren't entirely sure about. "He said to tell you that Faber is not a coincidence." Nora looked at him. "He didn't explain that. He just said to tell you." She processed this. "Tell him I heard him." Garrett nodded and left, and Nora went back to her work and let the thought settle in the way she let things settle, not pushing it, not picking at it, just setting it down and checking on it periodically like something that needed to be watched rather than handled. Faber was not a coincidence, which meant someone had known before Harlan was admitted to Westhaven, either that he would end up here or that if he did, there would be something worth looking at. Or it meant someone had made a call very quickly after his admission, faster than standard protocol would suggest, and that the call had gone somewhere specific. She thought about the flagged charts, the 12-page document. The administrative review convened with unusual speed. She thought about the fact that Harlan had been routed to Westhaven specifically, not to a military medical facility, which would have been more standard, but to a civilian level 1 in a mid-sized city, under circumstances the operators hadn't fully explained. She thought about this for the remainder of her shift, and she was still thinking about it when she got into the elevator at the end of the day, and the doors were almost closed when a hand came through and stopped them. Faber stepped in. They rode down in silence for one floor. Then he said, without looking at her, "You did good work in that trauma bay." She said nothing. "I read the chart," he said. "The timeline is clear." "I'm glad the chart is clear. The review will likely go in your favor. Grundle isn't looking for a fight with the IG office." "That's good to know." The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. Neither of them moved immediately. "Nurse Voss," Faber said. He was still looking at the elevator doors. "I've been with the Naval IG office for 11 years. Before that, I was in Naval Intelligence for 9. He picked up his briefcase. "In that time, I've read a lot of classified records, some of them more than once." He looked at her sideways, just briefly, just long enough. "Have a good evening." He walked out. She stood in the elevator until the doors began to close again, then stepped through them and crossed the lobby and pushed through the front doors into the late afternoon, where the air was cold and the light was going orange across the parking structure, and her hands were shaking. Not from the old injury, from something else. She sat in her car for a long time without starting it. Faber had read classified records. He had said it in the specific way people said things when they wanted you to hear something other than the words. 11 years in the IG office, 9 years before that in intelligence. Classified records he had read more than once. He knew. The question that had been academic until 30 seconds ago and was now very much not, was what he was going to do with it. She started the car. Her phone buzzed on the seat beside her before she pulled out of the space. Unknown number. She looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she picked up. Silence on the other end for just long enough that she thought the call had dropped. Then a voice she hadn't heard in a very long time. Rough, from a hospital room and medication, and 3 conversations she hadn't wanted to have. Reed Harlan. "I need to tell you something," he said, "before tomorrow." "How did you get this number?" "The same way Faber got assigned to this hospital in less than 18 hours. A pause, and in the pause she heard what it cost him to be upright and talking. The careful breath management, the control in his voice that was also a form of effort. There are people who have been looking for you, not to cause problems, to correct one. Another pause. Your record, Nora. Your actual record. Someone has been trying to get it declassified for 2 years, and when I came in through those doors yesterday, Colonel, her voice came out harder than she intended. It accelerated something that was already moving. She stared through the windshield at the parking structure's concrete column directly in front of her. I don't want my record changed, she said. I don't want to be found. I built something here, small, but mine. She stopped. I walked away from that life on purpose. I know, he said, but I don't think it's going to walk away from you. The silence between them was the kind that had weight. Outside the car, the parking lot was emptying. A pair of nurses crossed through the orange light, talking, one of them laughing at something. Normal. The ordinary movement of people at the end of a shift, going home, leaving the building and its problems behind them until tomorrow. What's happening tomorrow? She asked. The answer Harlan gave her was not what she expected, and it was specific enough and sourced enough that she could not dismiss it as medication talking. And by the time he finished, she was gripping the steering wheel with both hands, and the shaking had stopped entirely, which was how she always knew something had shifted from the manageable category into something else. She sat in the car for a long time after the call ended. Then she drove home, went to the closet, and for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, she opened the box. She opened the box. The medals were on top, which she hadn't remembered. She thought she'd put the citation papers first, but memory did its own reorganizing without permission. There were 4 of them in a velvet tray that had worn through at one corner, and she didn't pick them up. She just looked at them, the way you looked at something you'd lived with so long it had stopped being symbolic and just became a fact, like a scar or a changed gait. Underneath the tray were the papers, the citations, the commendations, the declassified portions of her service record that she'd been given at discharge, which were fewer pages than the full record by a considerable margin. And underneath those, face down, a photograph. She turned it over. 7 people in desert gear, squinting into flat, bright light. She was third from the left, thinner than she was now, her hair shorter, a medic bag over one shoulder, and an expression that she no longer recognized as her own face making it. The people around her were real names and real histories, and 3 of them were dead and 4 of them were not, according to what Harlan had just told her, and she looked at each face for a moment before she put the photograph back down. She did not put it back face down. She left it facing up and closed the box and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about what Harlan had told her. Tomorrow morning, a senior naval officer from Special Warfare Command was arriving at Westhaven Regional. Not because of Harlan's injury, or not only because of that. The declassification review that had been moving through naval records for 2 years had reached a decision point, and the decision point had apparently been accelerated by the fact that a classified combat medic had just kept one of their colonels alive in a civilian trauma bay using skills that did not appear on her official employment record. Someone had looked at the timeline. Someone had looked at the chart. Someone had then looked at the name Nora Voss and found that the name was recent, and the history behind it was thin in the specific way that deliberately constructed histories were thin, and they had made a call. Faber's presence was not coincidental. Faber had been the advance notice. She sat with this for a long time. The apartment was very quiet in the way it always was. She had chosen it for that, the particular absence of sound that came with facing north and having neighbors who kept to themselves. She had chosen a lot of things for the space they gave her. The job at Westhaven was supposed to be the same kind of choice, far enough from anything connected, modest enough to be invisible, useful enough to be worth doing without being high-profile enough to attract the kind of attention that names and records attracted. She had miscalculated. Not badly, but enough. She lay down on top of the covers with her boots still on and stared at the ceiling and thought, with the methodical practicality that had kept her functional through worse than this, about what tomorrow would look like and what she wanted from it and what she was willing to let happen and what she wasn't. By 2 in the morning, she had the outline of something that was less a plan than an acceptance, a decision about what she was going to walk into that building ready to do and what she was going to stop trying to prevent. It wasn't peace, exactly, but it was close enough to functional to work with. She slept for 3 hours. It was better than 2. She arrived at Westhaven at 6:45, 45 minutes before her shift started, which was her habit. The hospital in the early morning had its own specific quality. The overnight staff winding down, the day shift not yet fully present, the building in the brief metabolic lull between one sustained effort and the next. She liked this time. It had always felt more honest than the full operational hours, when performance and observation overlapped and everything was slightly heightened. She checked in, changed, did a walkthrough of her floor. At 7:20, Bet appeared at the nurse's station with the expression of someone who had information and had been waiting to deliver it. "There are 2 military people in the administrative lobby," she said. "Dress uniforms. Not Harlan's team, different, and Faber is back." Nora kept her eyes on the chart in front of her. "Okay." "Okay?" Bet stared at her. "Nora, dress uniforms." "I heard you." "Do you know what's happening?" She considered how to answer this honestly without answering it completely. "I think the review outcome may be influenced by some outside factors." "What outside factors?" "Bet." She looked up. "Go do your rounds, seriously. Whatever happens today, you're being caught in the middle of it doesn't help you." Bet looked like she wanted to argue. She also looked like she'd worked long enough in institutional environments to recognize advice that was genuinely for her benefit rather than a polite dismissal. She left. Nora went back to the chart. At 8:15, Grundle appeared at the door of the nurse's station. "Nurse Voss, the review panel is reconvening. Now." Nora closed the chart. "Now isn't my scheduled time. There are additional parties present. The timing has shifted." She looked at Grundle's face, which was doing its professionally neutral thing with slightly less success than usual. "I'll be there in 5 minutes." She wasn't being difficult about the 5 minutes. She used them to check on 2 patients, the elderly man with the wound infection, whose dressing needed to be noted for the day nurse, and the teenager with the headache, whose overnight note she'd flagged for physician review and wanted to confirm had been addressed. They had been. She wrote a short handoff note, and then she went to the elevator and wrote it to the administrative floor and walked down the corridor and pushed open the conference room door. The room had more people in it than it had yesterday. Grundle was there, and the 2 administrators. Vel was there, in the same chair, with his 12-page document that suddenly looked very thin relative to the room it was sitting in. Faber was there, in the same civilian clothes, with a slightly different quality of stillness. Attentive, rather than observational. The shift that happened when something moved from preliminary to active. And there were 2 people she hadn't seen before. A woman in navy dress uniform, captain's rank, with the bearing of someone who had spent 20 years learning how to walk into rooms and change their temperature just by entering. She was probably 50, with the kind of economy of movement that came from a long time spent not wasting anything. Her name tag read Calloway. Next to her, a man in his 40s in civilian clothes who had the hands of someone who worked with them, a JAG insignia on the folder in front of him, and an expression of careful professional neutrality that Nora recognized as the legal version of what Grundle's face did. She sat in the single chair on the near side of the table. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Captain Calloway said, "Nurse Voss, thank you for being here. My name is Captain Diana Calloway, Naval Special Warfare Command. I want to be direct with you about why I'm here, because I think you've had enough of rooms that aren't being direct." She glanced at the folder in front of her, then back up. 12 days ago, a request was processed through Naval Records Command to finalize a declassification review that has been ongoing for approximately 26 months. That review pertains to the service record of a combat medic who was officially listed as killed in action during an extraction operation in the Makar Valley 6 years ago. Vel had gone very still. Grundle was looking at the table. "The review concluded," Calloway continued, "that the KIA listing was an administrative error compounded by a classification decision made under field conditions that was never subsequently corrected through proper channels. The record in question belongs to a decorated service member who received, among other commendations, the Navy Cross, awarded for actions during a 12-hour sustained combat medical operation that saved the lives of 4 Naval Special Warfare operators and 3 embedded personnel." She paused. "The award was also classified, which means the person who earned it has been living without it on any record that anyone could see." She looked at Nora steadily. "I'd like to remedy that." The room was completely silent. Nora looked at Captain Calloway. She looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment she was aware of Vel's face in her peripheral vision. The progressive rearrangement of his expression as context assembled itself into meaning. and she was aware of Faber's careful stillness and the JAG officer's pen hovering above his notepad and Grundle's hands flat on the table, and she thought about the box in the closet, face-up photograph, velvet tray with the worn corner. "That's my record," she said. "Yes," Calloway said. "It is." The next 20 minutes were the strangest of Nora's recent life, which had contained some genuinely strange stretches. The JAG officer, his name was Bremer, walked through the legal and administrative framework of the declassification in terms that were precise and not overly long, which she appreciated. The KIA listing would be corrected to reflect her actual status. Her service record would be unsealed and updated to include the complete operational history, the commendations, and the Navy Cross. This did not change her civilian status. She had been honorably discharged prior to the Mashhar Valley operation through a medical separation and had then returned to the field in an embedded advisory capacity, which was the component that had been classified. The classification would be lifted. "Does this require anything from me?" she asked. "A signature on 3 documents," Bremer said, "confirming accuracy of record. It's your right to review them fully before signing, and you're welcome to have independent legal counsel if—" "I don't need counsel." She looked at the documents he slid toward her, read them. All 3, fully, without rushing, because she had learned a long time ago that signing things without reading them was how good people ended up in bad situations. The documents were accurate. She signed them. Grundle, who had been sitting in an increasingly uncomfortable quality of silence throughout this process, said carefully, "I want to make sure I understand the scope of—" "The scope," Calloway said, turning to look at her with the measured attention of someone who had prepared for this question, "is that the individual you have had under administrative review performed a clinically sound emergency intervention that saved the life of a senior naval officer. The clinical judgment she demonstrated in that trauma bay is consistent with a service record that includes over 100 battlefield medical interventions, multiple commendations for exactly this type of decision-making under pressure, and a Navy Cross for an operation that the trauma bay intervention, frankly, resembles closely." She set down her folder. "I would like to understand what the basis for the review is, given that context." Vell said, "The review was based on protocol." "Dr. Vell," Faber spoke for the first time, and the specific quality of his voice, not raised, not aggressive, just the particular register of institutional authority operating without apology, stopped Vell mid-sentence. "I've reviewed the flag documentation from the last 3 weeks. I've also reviewed the 2 prior personnel actions in this department over the last 4 years involving staff who contradicted the chief surgeon's clinical decisions publicly." He opened the folder in front of him. "I have some questions for the administrative team. Not today, next week. But I wanted you to know they're coming." The silence that followed was the kind that preceded significant institutional consequences, and everyone in the room who had been at Westhaven long enough knew what it sounded like. Nora looked at Vell. He was looking at the table. There was no satisfaction in it for her, or there was, somewhere, a small and human amount of it, because she was not actually made of stone, and the last 3 weeks had cost her something real. But the satisfaction was thin compared to the tiredness behind it, and she didn't let herself stay with it long. "I need to get back to my floor," she said. Calloway looked at her with something that was not quite a smile, but was in that direction. "Of course." She stood, picked up nothing because she had brought nothing, walked to the door and paused, with her hand on the frame, and turned back to the room. Not dramatically, just the way you turned back when you'd actually forgotten something, which she had. "The lower acuity assignment," she said, to Grundle specifically. "I'd like to return to the trauma department." Grundle opened her mouth. "Today," Nora said, "if possible." There was a pause. Then Grundle said, "I'll make the call." Nora left. The corridor felt different on the way back to the elevator. Not because anything about it had changed. Same beige walls, same fluorescent light, same institutional non-smell of a building that was constantly being cleaned. But there was a quality to moving through it that was slightly different from 3 weeks of moving through it, trying to take up less space than she actually required. She took the stairs. She was 3 flights down when the stairwell door above her opened and footsteps came after her. Quick, purposeful, not the random footsteps of someone also choosing the stairs. She stopped. Vell came around the landing above her and stopped when he saw she'd stopped. He was alone. He looked for the first time since she'd met him, uncertain in a way that was not managed. Not the controlled uncertainty of someone adjusting strategy, but the rawer kind that happened when a structural assumption collapsed suddenly enough that there wasn't time to build a new face around it. They looked at each other. "You should have told me," he said. It came out differently than he probably intended, less accusatory than it was meant to be, more like something that actually hurt. "Told you what?" she said. Not a question, just giving him space to hear himself. "Who you were, what you'd done." He stopped. "It would have changed how you treated me." She kept her voice level. "Yes. That's why it's a problem, Dr. Vell. Not what I did or didn't tell you. The fact that it would have made a difference." He didn't have anything for that. She went down the stairs and left him on the landing and pushed through the ground floor door and went back to work. The day was long and demanding in the way trauma days always were, because the trauma bay did not schedule itself around administrative events or personal revelations or the specific emotional state of the people working in it. A construction accident came in at 10:15. 2 workers, one with a crush injury to the lower leg that required immediate ortho consult, one with a headlock and suspected orbital fracture that looked worse than it was, which was the challenging kind because looking worse than it was still looked very bad and required the same initial management. Then a cardiac event at 11:40, an elderly man who had driven himself to the hospital had driven himself alone in active cardiac distress, which was the kind of thing that made you feel things about human stubbornness that were both exasperated and moved, and who survived because the triage nurse had fast-tracked him before he finished the intake form. Nora was back in the trauma bay, in position, doing the work. The staff around her were doing a thing that people did after significant information, rearrange the context of someone they'd known in a limited way. A recalibration, mostly invisible, expressed in the minor adjustments of people who were too professional to change their behavior dramatically, but were clearly, quietly, seeing her differently. Rosario handed her a chart without the slight hesitation she'd been doing for 3 weeks. Drew Packard made eye contact when he asked a clinical question. Small things. She noted them and did not make anything of them, because making something of them would have changed the texture of the shift, and the shift needed to run cleanly. At 2 in the afternoon, Garrett Lowe appeared in the trauma bay doorway. She looked at him across the room. He tilted his head in the direction of the corridor, which she took to mean Harlan wanted her, and had sent his version of a message rather than coming himself this time, which she appreciated as an improvement. She finished what she was doing, an IV adjustment that needed to be finished before she stopped, and then went to the door. "How is he?" she asked. "Better, crankier. The doctor says the chest tube can come out tomorrow if the drainage stays where it is." Garrett paused. "He wants to see you before that. He says it's not medical." "I know it's not medical. He said you'd say that." Garrett almost smiled. "He also said to tell you that Captain Calloway is going back to base tonight, and whatever you're going to do with all of this, you don't have to decide today." She looked at him. "He said that?" Word for word. She thought about Harlan in the corridor the night before, forcing himself upright on sheer determination to say a thing that mattered to him enough that he spent the energy on it. The 4 men. The one with kids. The one who teaches. The one with the blurry photograph in his wallet. "Tell him I'll come at the end of my shift," she said. Garrett nodded and left. She went back into the bay. The next patient came in at 2:30, a teenage girl, 16, brought in by ambulance from a school athletic event. Anaphylaxis, suspected, from something on the field. Her airway was partially compromised on arrival, the epinephrine from the school's kit having bought time but not resolved the situation, and the transport team had managed her well but not fully, and she came in with the specific quality of someone whose body was still fighting something it didn't understand, still swelling, still reactive. Nora was at the gurney before it cleared the bay doors. "Airway's holding, but she's got stridor," the transport medic said, moving fast through the handoff. "Epi at 12:15, no second dose. We've been at 7 minutes since last assessment." "Got it." Nora was already running her hands along the girl's neck, gently, precisely, checking the external landmarks while her eyes were on the monitor. Sat at 93 and variable. Pulse ox waveform irregular. Breathing labored but present. Stridor audible without a stethoscope. The high-pitched wheeze of a narrowing upper airway. The attending, a doctor named Suresh Tamboli, who had come on the day shift with a reputation for being fast and good, and not precious about who in the room had the right observation, appeared at the other side of the gurney. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "Not to anyone specific, to the room." "Second EP," Nora said. "And get respiratory here now, because if this doesn't turn in 3 minutes, we're going to need a decision about the airway." Tamboli nodded. "Do it." She did it. The second epinephrine dose went in clean, and then it was 3 minutes of watching the monitor and watching the girl, who was conscious, which was both good and challenging, because conscious patients in respiratory distress were frightened patients, and frightened patients breathed harder and made everything worse. Nora stayed at the head of the gurney and talked to her. Not soothing nonsense, not the performed calm of someone trying to sound calm, just direct and informational, which was actually what frightened people needed and rarely got. "Your airway is open. We're watching it. The medicine we gave you is going to help. I need you to slow your breathing down if you can. Like this." She demonstrated, not theatrically, just enough to give the girl something to follow. "You're doing fine." The girl's eyes tracked her. Nora held her gaze and breathed slowly and deliberately, and the girl, shakily, followed. The monitor crept upward. 94, 95, the stridor eased. By minute 6 post-second dose, the airway had opened enough that the decision about intubation moved from immediate to precautionary monitoring, and Tamboli exhaled in the controlled way that experienced doctors exhaled when a situation resolved in the direction you wanted. Quiet, undemonstrative, the exact opposite of how it looked in places that had never done this for real. "Nice," he said, looking at the SAT reading. To Nora, specifically. She was already documenting. The shift ended at 7. She changed, checked her phone, nothing from Harlan directly, one message from a number she didn't recognize that turned out to be Garrett confirming she was still coming, and went up to the 4th floor. Harlan's room was quieter than it had been. The second operator who'd been rotating in and out was absent, and Garrett was in the corridor rather than the room, giving them something that was as close to privacy as a hospital room got. She went in. Harlan was in the chair again, which she was going to have to say something about because the chair was not actually recommended positioning for a patient with an active chest tube, but she decided to say it after the conversation rather than before. "How's the pain?" she asked. "Managed." He looked at her with the direct quality she had come to expect from him. No warm-up, no social preamble. "Did it go the way you expected?" "Close enough." "Calloway is good. She's been working on this for a while, not just your file. There's a backlog of misclassified records from that operational period. Yours was the most significant." "You've been in contact with her?" "Since last year." He said it without apology. "I didn't know where you were, but I knew what should have been done and wasn't." She sat in the chair across from him, which was the only other place to sit, and looked at him steadily. "Colonel, why does this matter to you, personally, not operationally?" He was quiet for a moment. The monitor beside him beeped with the steady rhythm of someone who was actually recovering, slower and more even than it had been 2 days ago. Outside the window, Dorland had gone into its evening, the particular urban-adjacent dark of a mid-sized city, not the total black she'd slept under in other places, just a diffuse orange-gray that softened everything slightly. "There was a debrief," he said finally, "after Makar, standard after action. And in that debrief, I said that the combat medic performed with extraordinary distinction under conditions that should have been impossible. I said I wanted her formally recognized." He stopped. "I was told the recognition would be handled through proper channels, and that the classification of the operation meant it would be done quietly. I trusted that. I shouldn't have trusted that." "You didn't know?" "No, but I should have followed up." He looked at her with the particular expression of a person who had sat with something for a long time and not made peace with it, just learned to carry it. "You spent 6 years with a KIA on your record, a false one, and the thing you actually did, what you actually did out there, existed nowhere that anyone could see. That's not a paperwork error. That's a debt." She looked at the window, the diffuse orange dark. "I'm not sure I wanted it seen," she said. "I know. I came here to be quiet. I know that too. And now," she stopped. "Now this hospital knows. And Calloway's office knows. And whatever Faber does with his questions next week is going to make Vel's situation visible in a way that's going to be loud," Harlan said. "Yes. Is that bad?" She thought about it honestly rather than reflexively. The administrative review, Vell's 12-page document, and the specific fear underneath it. Bet's 14 years of watching and saying nothing. Drew Packard looking at his shoes. The teenager on the gurney this afternoon, following Nora's breathing, trusting the steadiness of someone who had no reason to be steady, except that steadiness was a skill she had built from necessity. So many times it had become structural. "No," she said. "I don't think it's bad." He nodded slowly, like someone receiving confirmation of something he'd suspected. They sat in the quiet for a moment that wasn't uncomfortable, which was its own kind of strange given where they were and what had happened. Then Harlan's monitor changed tone. Not dramatically, not the alarm register that meant something critical. A shift in the waveform, subtle, the kind of thing you noticed if you were watching and didn't if you weren't. Nora was watching. She was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to stand, crossing to the monitor, and what she saw made her go still for exactly the half second it took to process and decide, and then she was moving again, Bob. To the door, pulling it open. "Garrett," she said. He was up from this corridor chair immediately. "Get the on-call. Now. Tell them possible pneumothorax recurrence. Room 412. Get a card in here." Garrett moved. She went back to Harlan, who was looking at her with the expression of someone who had felt something change and was assessing how bad it was. "What's happening?" he said. "Your lung may be reaccumulating." She was already pulling on gloves, checking the chest tube, and there it was, the thing she'd caught in the monitor before she consciously named it. The drainage tube kinked subtly against the bed frame in the way it had probably been building since he'd moved to the chair. She straightened the line. "Don't move, and stop sitting in that chair." "Noted," he said, with the careful steadiness of a man managing the fact that his body was doing something alarming. "Does it hurt differently than it did an hour ago?" "A little? I thought it was the position." "It was the position. That's—" She checked the monitor. The waveform was stabilizing as the drainage resumed, but not fast enough. "Stay still. The on-call is coming." "Nora." She looked at him. "You're off shift. I'm aware." "You don't have to read." She used his first name without thinking about it, the way you defaulted to someone's first name in a clinical moment when the last name felt like too much distance. "Be quiet and let me work." He was quiet. The on-call physician, a woman named Dr. Alara Shin, second-year resident, who arrived at a run and stopped in the doorway with the look of someone arriving at a situation that was either manageable or not and needed 6 seconds to assess which, came in, and Nora gave her a clean, fast summary. Probable partial reaccumulation secondary to tube kinking, drainage resuming post-correction, SAT holding, patient stable, but needs imaging to confirm. "Chest x-ray," Shin said. "Yes, but he needs to stay horizontal while we wait. No more chair." "Agreed." Shin moved to Harlan's other side, and they worked, not in the smooth choreography of a team that had drilled together, but in the functional overlapping efficiency of two trained people with compatible instincts and clear roles, which was good enough and often better because it required less performance. By the time the portable x-ray came, Harlan was horizontal, monitor steady, sat at 96, and displaying the particular expression of a man who was irritated at his own body and trying not to show it. The x-ray confirmed a small reaccumulation, not critical, not the emergency the monitor shift had initially suggested, but real and requiring attention. The chest tube position was adjusted under Shin's hands with Nora assisting, and the drainage resumed at an appropriate rate, and by 9:15 the situation had resolved into the manageable category. Shin looked at Nora over the bed. "Good catch." The monitor flagged it. "You flagged it," Shin said. "The monitor was background noise until you looked at it." Nora didn't argue. Harlan, from the bed, said, "She does that." Shin glanced at him, then back at Nora with an expression that held a question she didn't ask out loud. "Go get some rest," Nora said to Harlan. "You too," he said. She almost said something about the chest tube, then didn't. Instead, she stripped her gloves, signed off on the monitoring notes, thanked Shin for the quick response, and left the room. Garrett was in the corridor with his arms folded and the expression of someone who had spent the last 40 minutes being professionally calm about something that had required effort. "He's going to be fine," she said. "I know." He looked at her. "You stayed." "I was here." "You were off shift." She stopped. looked at him. If I'd left and something had happened to him, I would have known I was here and could have caught it earlier. She said it plainly, no particular weight on it. That's not heroism. That's just how it works. Garrett nodded slowly, like someone filing information away for later. She took the elevator down, crossed the lobby, pushed through the front doors. The air outside was cold, properly cold now, the October night having settled into something with teeth. She stood on the front steps for a moment and let it hit her. The cold, the dark, the strange particular exhaustion of a day that had included a declassification, a stairwell conversation, an anaphylaxis case, and a near recurrence in a man she had spent 6 years theoretically not knowing. And she breathed it in and did not think about any of it specifically, just let it exist as the aggregate weight of a day that had contained many things. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A number she didn't recognize. Not Garrett's, not Harlan's room line, not Faber's card number, which she had memorized from the conference room table without intending to. She answered. Nurse Voss. A woman's voice, but not Calloway. Someone younger, with the clipped precision of someone reading from a document, or very close to one. This is Lieutenant Ferris, Naval Special Warfare Command, Administrative Office. I'm calling to confirm receipt of your signed documents from this morning's meeting. Confirmed, Nora said. Good. There's one additional item Captain Calloway wanted me to communicate directly. The correction to your service record becomes official at 0800 tomorrow. At that time, the Navy Cross citation will be entered into the public record as part of the declassification package. Nora was still. Public record, she said. Yes, ma'am. The citation, the operational summary, and the commendation narrative. Standard procedure for Navy Cross awards that were delayed in processing. There will be a press release through Naval Public Affairs. It's routine for posthumous correction cases. It's just a slight pause. In your case, of course, it's not posthumous. No, Nora said. It's not. Captain Calloway wanted you to know before it went out. As a courtesy. Another pause. Is there anything you'd like to communicate back to the captain? She looked at the dark parking lot, the orange-gray sky, the building she had walked into 3 weeks ago trying to disappear into the middle distance of ordinary life. Tell her thank you, she said, and tell her... She stopped, started again. Tell her I'll be at work tomorrow morning. Tell her that whatever this changes, it doesn't change that. I'll pass that along, the lieutenant said. Good night, Nurse Voss. The call ended. She stood on the steps of Westhaven Regional Medical Center in the October dark with the phone in her hand and the cold coming through her jacket and thought about the press release. Public record. A citation and an operational summary and a commendation narrative that had existed for 6 years in a locked file and was going to exist tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, somewhere that anyone could find it. Her name. Her real name. She had not used her real name in a long time. She had gotten so accustomed to Voss that it fit now, fit the way a garment fits when you've worn it long enough that it takes the shape of you. Her real name was going to be attached, tomorrow, to a document that would be searchable and visible and real. And Westhaven Regional would have that document, and Marcus Vell would have that document, and every person who had watched her in that trauma bay and recalibrated in the small, quiet way people recalibrated would have access to the full picture of what they'd actually been looking at. She started walking to her car. Halfway across the parking lot, she stopped. There was a vehicle parked 2 spaces from hers that had not been there when she'd arrived this morning. A dark sedan, nondescript, the kind of nondescript that was slightly too deliberate. And she had been reading vehicles for long enough that she registered it before she registered registering it. The driver's window rolled down. The man inside was not Faber. He was younger, late 30s, with the kind of face that had been in the sun too long in too many places, and the set of his jaw that said military in the way certain things said it without saying it. He looked at her with an expression that was the strangest combination she had encountered today, which was a high bar. Recognition. An apology, and something that looked almost like relief. You're harder to find than you used to be, he said. Her hand was not on anything. She was standing in a parking lot, and her hand was not on anything, and that was fine. That was who she was now, except for the 3 seconds when her body forgot that. Who sent you? She said. Not a question. Nobody sent me. He reached into the inside of his jacket slowly, with the deliberate visibility of someone who understood exactly why you moved slowly in this kind of moment, and produced a photograph. Even from 6 feet away, she could see it was old, printed on the kind of paper disposable cameras used. Blurry. Dark. "My name is Sergeant First Class Dominic Tran," he said. "Retired. I was one of the 4 operators in the Makar Valley." He held up the photograph. "I've been carrying this for 6 years, trying to find out who took it." She looked at the photograph. She looked at his face. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "I know." He didn't lower the photograph. "I drove 14 hours. The cold was very sharp. The parking lot was empty except for the 2 of them, and the space between them, and 6 years of something that had been classified and was, as of 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, going to be not classified anymore. I have something I need to say to you," he said, "and I drove 14 hours to say it in person, that's all. After that, I'll go." She looked at the photograph one more time, her face in it, blurry and dark and caught in a moment she hadn't known was being recorded, doing the thing she had always done, leaning over someone who was hurt, in a place that was dangerous, making the calculation that their life cost more than her safety. "What do you need to say?" she said. He opened the car door and got out, and he was taller than he'd looked sitting, and he held the photograph in both hands, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who had rehearsed something for a very long time, and was now standing in an actual parking lot in actual October cold, finding that the rehearsed version and the real version were not quite the same. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's 4. Her name is Nora." The cold settled around them. "I didn't know your name when I named her," he said. I knew someone had been out there. I knew someone had made a choice." He stopped. His jaw was tight. "I wanted my daughter to have that name in the world somewhere, even if I never found the person. Even if—" He stopped again, harder this time. "I found out this morning that the person was real and alive and working in a hospital in this city, and I drove 14 hours, and I'm standing here, and I don't—" He stopped a third time and did not try to fill it. Nora stood in the parking lot and looked at this man who had driven through the night to stand in the cold and say a thing he couldn't finish. And she thought about the box in the closet and the face-up photograph and the life she had built out of a need to be somewhere quiet. And she felt something move through her that was not grief and not joy and not anything she had a clean word for. Something that was made of all of those things in different proportions, the way a long operation was made of 100 individual decisions that only became meaningful in retrospect. "You named your daughter Nora," she said. "Yes. That's—" She stopped. Behind them, the hospital's automatic doors opened and a cluster of night shift nurses came through, talking, dispersing into the parking lot in the ordinary way of people going home. Their voices carried in the cold for a moment and then diminished as they moved toward their cars. The ordinary world, going about itself. And Dominic Tran standing in the middle of it with a blurry photograph and 14 hours of highway behind him and an expression that was the most human thing she had seen all day, which was a considerable thing given the day she had had. She looked at him. "I'm going to lose my parking spot if we stand here," she said. "There's a diner 2 blocks north that stays open until midnight." He looked at her for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." They walked, and the hospital was behind them with its lit windows and its overnight machinery and its morning press release already written and waiting, and somewhere inside it, Reed Harlan was horizontal, on physician's orders, and probably already plotting how to get back to the chair, and tomorrow the record would be corrected, and the name would be visible. And the quiet life she had built in this city was going to be something different than it had been this morning. She walked beside a man she didn't know, and had saved and had never met, past cars and light and ordinary things, into the kind of October night that felt, in its cold and its clarity, like the last moment of something before it became something else. And she didn't know yet whether that was better or whether it was simply different, only that it was real, and she was in it, and somewhere a 4-year-old girl in a place she didn't know was asleep with a name that had been placed in the world like something that deserved to persist. Her phone buzzed one more time. She looked at it. A message from a number she had not seen before. Not Garrett, not Harlan's room, not Calloway's office. A message that contained 4 words and an attachment she could not immediately identify. And when she read the 4 words, her steps slowed and then stopped entirely. There on the sidewalk in the October dark, 2 blocks from a diner, while Dominic Tran took 2 more steps before he noticed she'd stopped and turned back to look at her. The 4 words were, We need to talk. The attachment was a photograph, not the blurry disposable camera one from Makar Valley. A different photograph, recent, by the quality of it, taken in bright outdoor light, high resolution, the kind of image a phone camera made in good conditions. And in it, standing outside a building she didn't recognize, was a man she had not seen in 6 years and had very good reasons never to see again. The man who had signed the classification order that had put her name on the KIA list in the first place. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Dominic Tran was watching her from 3 feet away with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to read situations by reading people. And what he was reading in her face now was clearly not what he'd expected to see, because his expression shifted from the open vulnerability of 2 minutes ago into something more alert. "What is it?" he said. She turned the phone so he could see the screen. She did it without thinking, which told her something about how far her guard had come down in the last 20 minutes, which she filed and would think about later. He looked at the photograph, at the 4 words, back at her. "Who sent this?" "I don't know the number." She was already moving through what she knew and what she didn't, the way she moved through it. Not panicked, just systematic. The way you ran a fast inventory when something changed. The number was unrecognized. The photograph was recent. The man in it was Colonel Whitford Brask, retired, who had been the commanding officer of the Special Operations Liaison Unit that had embedded her in Makar Valley, and who had, in the 3 days after the extraction, signed the documentation that classified her record, listed her as KIA, and buried everything under clearance levels that had taken Calloway's office 2 years to cut through. She had not thought about Brask in a long time. She had spent considerable energy making sure she didn't think about Brask, because thinking about Brask required thinking about the question of whether what he'd done was expedient or deliberate, and that question had no answer she could access, and unanswerable questions were the kind she had learned to set down. But someone else had apparently picked it up. "Do you know him?" Dominic asked. "Yes." "Who is he?" "Someone who made a decision 6 years ago that I've been living with." She looked at the message again. 4 words. No follow-up. The timestamp was 32 minutes ago, which meant it had been sent while she was still in the hospital, while Harlan was having his near recurrence, while she was focused entirely on the chest tube and the monitor and the corrected drainage line. Whoever sent this had timed it or gotten lucky. She typed back, "Who is this?" 30 seconds. A minute. The diner 2 blocks north was still open, and she was still standing on a sidewalk in October cold, with a man she'd technically met for the first time 7 minutes ago, and the message sat there, read but unanswered. Then, "Someone who was in the room when Brask signed the order. Meet me tomorrow. I'll come to you." She stared at the screen. Dominic was reading over her shoulder, which she would normally have moved to prevent, but she was processing too many things in parallel, and her instinct for physical space had temporarily lost the priority argument. "That's about your record," he said. Not a question. "Yes." "Someone who was there when it was signed." "That's what they're saying." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Is that good or bad?" She didn't have a clean answer for that. Someone in the room when the classification was signed could be a witness to wrongdoing or a participant in it or both. And without knowing who the number belonged to, she couldn't weight those options. She texted back, "Name." A pause. Then, "Mallory Kwan. I was Brask's administrative officer. I countersigned the document. I've been trying to find a way to undo that for 5 years. She breathed out slowly through her nose. "Okay," Dominic said, reading it. "That seems... I don't know what that is yet," she said. "It could be exactly what it says. It could be someone who has learned that the declassification is public tomorrow morning and is trying to get ahead of their own exposure." She typed, "How did you find this number?" Sent it. "Faber gave it to me. He said you'd want to know I existed before the morning press release." She looked at that for a moment. Faber, who had been in the IG office for 11 years and in naval intelligence for 9 before that, and who had sat in the administrative review with the careful stillness of someone who had already read several chapters ahead. Of course. She put the phone in her pocket. "I need to think," she said to Dominic, who was waiting with the particular patience of someone who understood that thinking was a necessary precursor to decisions and did not try to fill the space it required. "Diner's still open," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." They walked. The diner was called Opal's, and it had been in Dorland for at least 40 years based on the age of the tile and the style of the counter stools and the menu lamination, which had the particular yellowing of something that had not been updated in a decade. It was mostly empty. A man at the counter with his back to them, a couple in a booth by the window, a waitress who was probably working a double and showed it in her eyes without showing it in her efficiency. They took a corner booth. Nora faced the door. Dominic noticed and took the seat across from her without comment. She ordered coffee. He ordered the same plus pie, which she found she didn't have a strong opinion about either way. She told him about Brask in the direct way she told people necessary things. No more than was needed, structured by what was relevant rather than what was complete. The Makar operation, the classification, the KIA listing. She had not told this to anyone outside of the conversation with Harlan, and the experience of saying it out loud in a diner booth was strange, in the way experiences were strange when they had existed entirely inside you for a long time and then didn't. Dominic listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he said, "And this woman, Kwan, she countersigned the order. That's what she says. And now she wants to talk. Now that the declassification is going public tomorrow, she wants to talk." She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug, which was warm and slightly chipped at the rim. The timing is not subtle. No. He thought about it. But it's also not necessarily dishonest. People who've sat on things for years sometimes move when the window closes, when it's no longer possible to pretend the thing didn't happen. She looked at him. "I'm not defending her," he said. He shrugged. "I drove 14 hours because I finally had an address. The window closing can do things to people." She considered this. It was a fair point, and she was not in the habit of dismissing fair points simply because they complicated her preferred analysis. "I'll meet her," she said. "Tomorrow, after the press release." He nodded. They sat in the relative quiet of the near-empty diner, and she drank the coffee, and he ate the pie. Peach, she noted, not because it mattered. And after a while they talked about other things, the kind of other things that two people talked about when they had gotten through the necessary parts and needed to exist as human beings for a few minutes before whatever came next. He told her about his daughter, about the 4 years of her, about the particular experience of being a person whose entire professional formation had been about moving toward danger and then having a small human who needed you specifically to not do that. "I run a veteran services nonprofit now," he said. "Transition support, employment, mental health resources." "That's good work." "It's hard work." He smiled slightly. "Some days I think field operations were simpler." "Some days they were," she said. When she left, she shook his hand, which felt inadequate for what had just happened, but she was not sure what the adequate version was, and so she did the available one. He gave her his card, a real card, with the nonprofit's name on it, Transition Services, which she suspected he had not intended to name quite so on the nose, but which had a simple directness she found she liked. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "you know where to find me." Or the other way around, apparently. She almost smiled. "Thank you for driving 14 hours. Thank you for—" He stopped. "You know." She nodded. She went home. She slept 5 hours. It was enough. The press release went out at 8:03. Nora was already in the hospital when it did, had been there since 6:45, same as always, and she knew the exact moment it landed because of what happened to the nursing station. Rosario was the first one she saw react. She was at the computer, coffee in hand, when her expression changed in the particular way of someone reading something unexpected, and she looked up and found Nora 20 feet away and looked back at the screen, and then at Nora again with the expression of someone reconciling two things that had not previously been in the same category. Then Drew Packard came through the door with his phone in his hand and stopped when he saw her. He opened his mouth, closed it. His expression had the quality of a man reviewing the last 3 weeks from a significantly revised vantage point and finding the view uncomfortable. "Nurse Voss," he said. "Dr. Packard. He stopped again. "I read." "I know," she said. "We have a shift to run." He nodded and put his phone in his pocket. And that was that, more or less, except for the next 2 hours, during which she was aware of the changed texture of the room around her. The looks that were not quite covert because people were not quite managing to make them covert. The conversations that paused slightly when she walked into spaces. The recalibration she had predicted yesterday, expressing itself in the specific way of a team that was still professional but was processing something that required processing. She did not make it easier or harder for them. She did the work. Bet found her at 9:15 in the supply room, which was apparently their location. Navy Cross, Bet said. Bet, you have a Navy Cross. She said it with a flatness that was not the absence of feeling, but the presence of too much of it being managed simultaneously. You were walking around this hospital for 3 weeks with a Navy Cross in a box somewhere, and Vel was flagging your documentation for... She stopped, put her hands on her hips. I don't know what to do with that information. You don't have to do anything with it, Nora said. It doesn't change the work. It changes, Bet started, then stopped, looked at her steadily. Does it bother you? That we didn't know? That we treated you the way that he treated you the way he did? Nora thought about this honestly, the way Bet deserved. It would have bothered me more if I'd let it at the time, she said. Right now it's just done. It happened, and it's done. And I'm here. Bet looked at her for a long moment. You're a strange person, she said finally, without malice. Yes, Nora agreed. I know. At 10:30, Grundle appeared in the trauma bay doorway with a look on her face that Nora had not seen before. Not the practiced neutrality of administration managing a situation, but the more complicated expression of a person who had been part of a machinery that had done something it shouldn't and was standing in the immediate aftermath of that becoming visible. Dr. Vel is not in the building today, Grundle said. Nora waited. He called in. A pause. He cited personal reasons. Okay, Nora said. The review. Grundle stopped, started again. The review findings will be formally communicated to you this afternoon, but I wanted to tell you personally before that she stopped a third time. Grundle. Nora kept her voice level, not unkind. It's fine. It's not entirely fine. No, she agreed, but it's done, and I'd rather spend the next 6 hours taking care of patients than discussing the review, if that's possible. Grundle nodded. She left with the quality of someone who had wanted to say more and recognized that the person in front of her had made a choice about what this day was going to be, and that it was not her place to override it. Nora went back to the trauma bay. At 11, Harlan's chest tube came out. She was not the nurse on his care, and she did not go in for the procedure, but she happened to be in the corridor when it was done, and she happened to be there when Garrett came out with the drainage collection equipment, and their eyes met briefly, and Garrett said, "He's asking about discharge timeline," with the exact same phrasing he'd used 2 days ago, which she suspected was deliberate. "Tomorrow at the earliest," she said. "Tell him I'll be in to say goodbye." Garrett nodded. She went back to work. At 1:15, she met Mallory Kwan. She had arranged it through the texted number. A meeting in the hospital's ground floor family consultation room, which was small and had soft chairs and was rarely used in the early afternoon, and which Nora had chosen partly for the privacy and partly because it was still hospital property, and that felt, for reasons she didn't fully articulate even to herself, like the right kind of ground. Mallory Kwan was in her mid-50s, with the kind of face that had been precise once and had softened unevenly, the way faces did when the decades brought a mix of things. She was in civilian clothes, nothing military about the way she dressed or moved anymore, which told Nora she'd been out for a while. She was sitting when Nora came in and she stood up immediately, which was also something, the reflex of someone who had been trained into a certain posture around certain people and couldn't fully revise it. "Thank you for meeting me," Kwan said. "Tell me what you have," Nora said. She sat. Kwan sat. No preamble on Nora's end, which Kwan seemed to register as permission to also skip it. "When Brask signed the classification order," Kwan said, "I was his administrative officer. I handled the documentation. I countersigned because that was my job and I was 29 and I didn't understand." She stopped. "That's not accurate. I understood what I was doing. I didn't understand the full consequences of it, but I understood that a woman's service record was being buried and I signed the document anyway." She held Nora's gaze, which Nora had not entirely expected. "I'm not here to excuse that. I'm here because Brask is making contact." Nora went still. "He reached out to me 4 days ago," Kwan said. After the IG office notified him that the declassification review was concluding, he wanted to know if I was going to... She paused. He used the word collaborate. He wanted to know if I was going to collaborate with the review team. What did you tell him? I told him I needed to think. She looked at her hands. I've been thinking about this for 5 years. I know that's too long. I know the right thing would have been to refuse the order in the first place, and if I couldn't do that, to come forward sooner, and I didn't do either of those things, and I don't have a good explanation for that, that isn't just... She stopped. Inertia and fear. What does Brask want? Nora said. Direct. They didn't have time for the full archaeology of Kwan's conscience, and she didn't want to sit through it. He wants me to say the classification was justified under operational security grounds. Standard criteria. Nothing personal, nothing improper. Just a field decision made under appropriate authority to protect ongoing operations. She looked up. He's going to try to frame it that way to the IG investigation. He's going to say the KIA listing was an administrative error made in the field by a subordinate without his knowledge, and the classification was unrelated to you specifically, and there's no record connecting those two decisions. Is there a record? Kwan reached into the bag beside her chair and put a USB drive on the table between them. Nora looked at it. When I countersigned the order, Kwan said, I kept a copy of the original draft, the one before Brask revised it, because I was 29 and I had enough instinct left to know that the revision mattered, even if I didn't have enough courage to do anything about it at the time. She looked at the drive. The original draft lists you by name and specifically references your status adjustment, the KIA listing, as a coordinated decision. Not an error, a decision. The room was very quiet. That's the record that connects them, Nora said. Yes. And you've had this for 6 years? Yes. Kwan said it without flinching, which Nora had to respect on some level, the specific courage of sitting with the full weight of something and not trying to minimize it. I have had it for 6 years. I have told myself various things about why I didn't come forward, and some of them had partial truth in them, and none of them were actually sufficient. Nora looked at the drive. She thought about the Makar Valley, about 12 hours of field surgery in the dark, under fire, with equipment that wasn't designed for what she was doing with it. About putting 4 operators on the extraction bird and going back to cover because that was the only way to make the math work. About the cold that had come after, the physical cold, the air and the ground. The 2 hours she had been alone in a compromised position before the second extraction came. And the other cold, the one that had come later, when she'd finally been somewhere safe enough to start processing, and had found out, through a contact she trusted, that her name was on a list that said she wasn't coming back. She had built Nora Voss out of that cold. She had built a quiet life in a small apartment and a competence she kept low profile in a box in a closet that she occasionally opened now, apparently. She picked up the drive. Kwan exhaled. I need to give this to Faber, Nora said. I know. That's why I brought it to you and not directly to his office. Kwan paused. I wanted you to have it first, in your hands, before it became evidence in someone else's process. Nora turned the drive over once. It was ordinary, small, black, the kind that came in a 3-pack. She thought about what was on it and what it meant and what would happen when Faber had it, which was a sequence of events that would not be within her control and was not meant to be. What is Brask going to do when the press release goes public? She asked. He's already done it, Kwan said. He issued a statement this morning through a retired officers association, calling the declassification politically motivated, questioning the operational record. She paused. Questioning your specific role in the Makar extraction. Nora looked at her. He's saying the combat medic narrative is exaggerated, Kwan said. That the record was buried for legitimate operational security reasons unrelated to the commendation dispute. That the Navy Cross recommendation was inflated by field reports submitted by people who didn't have full situational awareness. He's saying the commendation isn't real. Yes. Nora set the drive on the table and looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Faber. He answered on the second ring. Nurse Voss. Brask issued a statement this morning. I'm aware. I have something for you. Family consultation room, ground floor, Westhaven Regional. A pause. Bring your documentation, people. A beat of silence. I'll be there in 20 minutes. She ended the call. Looked at Kwan. He's coming. Kwan nodded. She looked north, like someone who had set down something very heavy and was not entirely sure the feeling was relief or just the strange absence of a familiar weight. "What happens to you in this?" Nora asked. "I countersigned the order," Quan said. "I'll face whatever that means." "Do you have counsel?" "Yes." "Good." She looked at the drive. "Is there anything else on this?" "Emails, 3 of them, between Brask and the operations director at the time. They referenced the KIA adjustment explicitly as a means of—" She stopped. His word was simplifying the operational record. Simplifying. 6 years of her life, simplified out of the record by a man who had decided her existence complicated things. Faber arrived in 18 minutes, not 20, with a woman from his documentation team carrying a laptop and a chain of custody form that Nora signed and Quan signed and Faber signed, and the drive was logged and bagged in the matter-of-fact way of people who had done this before. And Quan gave her statement to the documentation officer in the careful, organized way of someone who had been rehearsing it for a long time, and Nora sat through the first part of it and then said she needed to get back to the floor, because she did, and because the part that remained was Quan's and Faber's and didn't require her. She was at the door when Faber said, "Nurse Voss?" She turned. "Brask's statement is going to get coverage," he said. "You should be prepared for that." "I know. Do you want to respond to it?" She thought about this, about what a response would look like, about the particular performance of publicly defending a record that had just been officially corrected, and what that would cost in energy and attention. "No," she said. "Let the record respond." He nodded. "That's what I'd recommend." She went back to her floor. The afternoon was busy in the way afternoons were busy. Not a single large event, but the sustained accumulation of needs. The ordinary crisis management of a trauma department that never fully exhaled. She worked through it. She did not check her phone for coverage of Brask's statement. She checked it once at 3, because she was human and the curiosity was real, and found 2 news aggregator notifications she dismissed without reading. What she did read, at 3:45, was a text from Garrett that said, "Colonel says if you're not up here before he's discharged tomorrow, he'll find an excuse to stay another day." His words. She put her phone away and almost smiled. At 4:20, the thing she had been peripherally aware might happen, happened. Marcus Vell walked into the hospital. She heard him before she saw him. His voice in the corridor, at a register she hadn't heard from him before, which was higher and faster than his usual controlled register, the specific pitch of someone who had spent a day somewhere private running calculations and had come back with a response. She was at the nurse's station when he came around the corner, and the staff around her registered his arrival with the collective, careful non-reaction of people who understood that something was about to happen and had decided to be very busy with other things. He saw her. He stopped. He looked different. Not worse, exactly. His suit was still good. His posture was still the posture of a man who had been confident for most of his life. But there was something in his face that hadn't been there before, some structural thing that had been load-bearing and was no longer, and the absence of it changed everything about the surface. He walked toward the station. She stayed where she was. "I read the citation," he said. He said it quietly, which was its own kind of notable. "Okay," she said. "The Makar Valley operation." He stopped. His jaw moved. "I want to say something." She waited. She did not help him. "I was wrong," he said. "About you. About what I assumed and what I did based on those assumptions." He said it in the flat, direct way of someone who had made a decision about how to do this and was doing it before they changed their mind. "The review I initiated was—" He stopped. "It was what it was. I can't undo it." "No," she said. "You can't." "I don't expect you to—" He stopped again. "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to say it to your face." She looked at him steadily. He was not a good man exactly, and he was not a simple man, and whatever had shifted in him today might hold or might not, and she had no way of knowing which. What she knew was that he was standing in front of her saying a thing that was true, and that it had cost him something to come back into this building to say it. "I heard you," she said. He nodded once. He turned and walked back the way he'd come, and the staff around the nurse's station remained very busy with their other things until he was out of sight. And then Rosario looked up from her computer at Nora with an expression that had a question in it. Nora shook her head slightly. Rosario went back to her computer. The rest of the shift passed. At 6:30, she was in the locker room pulling off her stethoscope when her phone rang. Not a text, an actual call, from a number that resolved immediately in her contacts as Faber. "The email's on the drive," he said, without preamble. "Yes." "They're sufficient, more than sufficient." A pause. "Brask is going to be invited to respond to an IG inquiry. Today, if possible, but his counsel will probably delay until tomorrow." Another pause, and in it she could hear the particular quality of someone who had found what they were looking for and was being careful with it. He's also, as of approximately 2 hours ago, withdrawn his statement from the Retired Officers Association website. He withdrew it. His counsel apparently advised him that doubling down on the record dispute after the evidence Quan provided was not in his best interest. She sat down on the bench in the locker room. The lockers were the particular institutional green that locker rooms always seem to default to, as if there were a regulation about it. "What happens next?" she said. "The inquiry convenes, the emails and the original draft document are submitted. The IG report goes to Naval Records and then to the Secretary's office." Faber paused. "It's a process. It takes months, not days. But it happens." "Yes," he said. "It happens." She exhaled. "There's one more thing," Faber said. "Captain Calloway asked me to relay this directly, because she thought it should come from someone who had been there." A beat. "The Navy Cross is being formally presented, not mailed, not filed, formally presented, at Westhaven Regional, at a time and date to be determined based on your schedule." Another pause. "You get to say when." She sat with that. "Why at the hospital?" she asked. "Because that's where you did the work," Faber said. Calloway's words, "both times." The locker room was empty and quiet. The institutional green walls. The sound of the hospital on the other side of them, its machinery and its ordinary crises and the continued turning of its days. "Okay," she said. "Okay." "Tell her I'll let her know." She ended the call, sat for another moment. Then she stood, hung her stethoscope on the hook, and picked up her bag. Her phone buzzed one last time before she made it to the door. Not Faber, not Garrett, not Harlan's room line. A number she did recognize because it had appeared in the IG documentation Faber had shared with her earlier that afternoon as a contact associated with Brask's statement. His counsel's office, which should not have had her number, which meant someone had given it to them, and the message was 3 words: "Call me, urgent." She looked at it. Then she looked at the locker room door. Then she looked back at the message. Brask's counsel, who had advised him to take the statement down, who was calling her directly, which was irregular in a way that was either a mistake or deliberate, and the things that were irregular and deliberate were always more interesting and more dangerous than the things that were irregular and accidental. She stood in the locker room with his phone in her hand and understood, with the particular clarity of someone who had spent a long career reading the moments just before something changed, that this was one of those moments, not the change itself, but the last beat before it, the held breath, the still second, and that whoever was on the other end of this call had either information she needed or a problem she hadn't accounted for, and either way the call was going to alter the shape of tomorrow in a way she couldn't fully predict from here. She pressed call. It rang once. "Nurse Voss," said a man's voice she didn't recognize, measured, professional, the voice of someone used to high-stakes conversations. "Thank you for calling back. My name is Philip Sear. I represent Colonel Brask." A brief pause. "I'm calling because my client has decided to make a full statement to the IG investigation, without conditions." Another pause. "But before he does, there's something he says you need to know first. Something about the Mocker operation that's not in any of the documents. Something he says he told no one." The locker room was very quiet. "He wants to tell you personally," Sear said, "before it goes on record." She looked at the institutional green wall, at the hook where her stethoscope had been, at the door. "When?" she said. "Tonight," Sear said. "He's here, in Dorlin. He drove." She said, "Where?" Not a question about whether, just where. Sear gave her an address. A hotel 2 blocks from the hospital, the kind of mid-range business hotel that existed in every mid-sized city, unremarkable by design. He said room 344. He said Brask was alone except for him. He said if she wanted to bring anyone, that was her choice. She said she'd be there in 30 minutes. She called Faber from the parking lot. Brask is in Dorland, she said. His counsel called me. He wants to make a full statement but says there's something he needs to tell me first. Tonight, in person. A pause. I don't like that, Faber said. I don't need you to like it. I need you to know it's happening. Nora. He used her first name, which was the first time he had, and it landed with the slight surprise of something unexpected. You don't have to go. I know I don't have to. She was already walking. The night was cold again, the same October cold, like the city had settled on a temperature and decided to commit. If he has something that's not in the documents, I want to hear it from him directly before it becomes testimony, before it becomes something that gets shaped by process. If he's trying to… Faber. She stopped walking for a moment. I spent 6 years being defined by a decision he made in a room I wasn't in. If he has something to say about that, I want to be in the room this time. A long pause. I'm going to be 20 minutes behind you, he said. That's your choice, she said. She walked the 2 blocks. The hotel lobby was what she'd expected. Mid-range carpet, a front desk staffed by someone who looked like they were finishing a long shift. The particular smell of climate-controlled air that had been recycled through the same building for years. She took the elevator to the 3rd floor without stopping at the desk. Room 314 was at the end of the corridor, and the door opened before she knocked, which meant someone had been watching through the peephole, which she had also expected. Philip Sear was younger than his voice, mid-40s, in a suit that was good but had been on a long drive in it. He stepped back from the doorway with the careful courtesy of someone managing a situation that had a lot of variables. Brask was sitting in the chair by the window. She had not seen him in 6 years. He had aged in the specific way that certain men aged when the authority that had structured their lives was removed. Not badly, but visibly, the scaffolding gone and the face underneath it more exposed than it wanted to be. He was 60-something now. His hands, resting on his knees, were still. His eyes when they found her were the eyes of a man who had rehearsed this moment and found, as Dominic Tran had found in a parking lot 24 hours ago, that the rehearsed version and the real one diverged at the point of actual contact. She stood inside the door. Sear moved to the corner of the room in the deliberate way of a lawyer who understood his function and when it didn't include him. Nurse Voss, Brask said. Colonel Brask, she said. He hadn't been a colonel anymore for 3 years. Retired, the rank became courtesy. But she used it because it was what she had called him, and it was the version of him she needed to be in the room with. Thank you for coming, he said. She did not say it was fine. She stood and waited because she was good at waiting and she had not driven 14 hours or crossed 2 blocks for pleasantries. He looked at his hands, then back up. In the Makar Valley debrief, he said, 3 days after the extraction, you were listed as KIA in the field report submitted by the site commander. That part, the field report, I didn't generate. That was a subordinate call made in bad conditions with incomplete information, and it was wrong, and I know that. She said nothing. The classification, he said, that was mine. He held her gaze, which she could see cost him something. You're waiting to hear if I'm going to say it was operational security. I'm not going to say that. It was operational security the way a locked door is security. It kept things contained that I thought were better contained. He stopped. There was a congressional inquiry pending into that operational period. Specific questions about the use of civilian contracted embedded personnel in forward operations. Your role in Makar, what you did, the scope of it, would have been significant testimony. It would have drawn attention to a program that multiple people above my rank wanted to keep quiet. So you buried my record to protect the program, she said. Yes. He said it without qualifier. I told myself the classification was temporary, that when the inquiry concluded, I would correct the KIA and surface the record through proper channels. He paused. The inquiry ran for 2 years. By the time it was over, the correction had become a thing I'd been not doing for long enough that doing it meant explaining why I hadn't done it sooner. He looked at her directly. I kept not doing it. The room was quiet. Outside the window, Dorland's diffuse orange-gray evening pressed against the glass. What is it you needed to tell me? She said. That's not in the documents. He reached into the bag beside his chair and put something on the table between them. A physical folder, paper, which was already unusual. He opened it. Inside were documents she hadn't seen before, not the classification order, not the operational record. Something older. Handwritten on the top sheet, in the particular format of a military recommendation, was her name, and below it a paragraph that she recognized structurally as a citation. "I wrote the Navy Cross recommendation," Brask said. "Before I signed the classification. I wrote it the week after the extraction, because what you did warranted it, and I knew it warranted it, and I submitted it through proper channels, and then I classified it along with everything else." He paused. "I have the original here, the one I wrote. Not because it changes what I did afterward, just because I wanted you to see that I knew. Before I did what I did, I knew exactly what I was erasing." She looked at the handwritten recommendation. She looked at it for a long time. There was something about seeing it in his handwriting, not the official processed version that Calloway had presented, but this, the original, the thing written in the week after Makar, when he had understood what he was dealing with and had put it into words before deciding to hide it. That was different from everything else she had read about herself in the last 48 hours. Different because it was before he'd made his choice. This was the version of Whitford Brask that had looked at what she did and called it exactly what it was. Then he had put it in a box and locked the box. "Why did you drive here?" she said. He exhaled. It was not a simple exhale. "Because it's going into the IG record tomorrow, and I wanted you to have it in your hands first, not as a copy, the original." He looked at the folder. "It should have been in your hands 6 years ago." She picked up the folder. She stood there holding it in a mid-range hotel room in Dorland, Colorado, with the man who had buried her under a false name for 6 years sitting across a low table from her. And she felt the weight of the paper and thought about the box in the closet and the face-up photograph and the 4 men who were alive and the girl named Nora, who was 4 years old and asleep somewhere tonight. And she thought about 12 hours of field surgery in the dark, and about 3 weeks of trembling hands in a hospital where no one knew what the trembling was from, and about a teenage girl following her breathing on a gurney in a trauma bay, and about Bet saying, "I am tired of watching this happen," and saying nothing, and about the particular quality of Harlan forcing himself upright in the corridor to say a thing that mattered to him enough to spend the energy on it. She thought about all of this, and she did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm going to give this to Faber when he gets here." Brask nodded. "I know." "And you're giving a full statement tomorrow?" "Yes." "Everything, including the congressional inquiry and the program and the names of the people above you who wanted it quiet." He looked at her. Something moved through his expression. Not quite surprise, just the adjustment of a man recalibrating what this conversation was going to cost him. "Yes." "Good." She closed the folder. "Then we're done tonight." He stood slowly, the way older men stood when their joints had history. He did not extend his hand, which she was glad about because she hadn't decided what she would have done with it. He looked at her with the complicated expression of a man at the end of a very long reckoning. "I don't expect," he started. "Don't," she said. "Not tonight." He stopped. Faber arrived 11 minutes later, knocked twice, and came in to find Nora holding a folder and Brask sitting back in his chair and CR in the corner doing his job of being invisible. The handoff of the folder was efficient and documented, and the chain of custody form was signed in the same matter-of-fact way as the drive earlier that day. And then Nora left. And the cold outside was the same cold it had been all night, and she walked back to the hospital parking lot and got in her car and sat in it for 4 minutes. Not processing. She was done processing for today. Just sitting, in the particular way of someone who has been moving through a very long series of necessary things, and has arrived at the first moment in hours when nothing immediately necessary is required. Then she drove home. She slept 7 hours. It was the most she'd slept in 3 weeks. She was back at Westhaven at 6:45. Same as always. The shift was different from any she'd worked there. Not because of anything that had changed structurally. The trauma bay was the same. The patients were real and demanding and present. The work was the work. But the texture of it was different in the specific way textures changed when people knew something and were integrating it without quite having finished integrating it yet. Drew Packard asked her a clinical question early in the shift and waited for her answer with an attentiveness that was different from how he'd waited before. Not differently respectful, exactly, just differently present. Like he was actually listening, rather than confirming a hierarchy. It was a small thing. She noticed it and did not comment on it because commenting on it would have made it strange. Rosario brought her coffee without being asked, which was also new, and when Nora looked at her, Rosario said simply, "You don't have to say anything," and went back to her station. Tamboli caught her in the corridor before the first trauma intake and said, "I heard the statement is going in today." "The IG statement, yes. Is there anything you need from the department?" She considered the question. "Keep running the bay the way you've been running it," she said. "That's what I need." He nodded, walked away. No ceremony, which was what she wanted. The intake that morning was a multi-vehicle accident. 3 patients, 2 with significant injuries. 1 with injuries that looked significant and turned out, after assessment, to be less so, which was the kind of case that required as much careful management as the others, because the relative stability could mask something changing. She ran the first patient alongside Tamboli, ran the assessment, called the escalations, documented cleanly. By the time the acute phase was done, she had sweat through the back of her scrubs, and her hands were steady, and she was completely, entirely in it, not performing, not managing a presentation, just working. She was most herself when she was working. She had always known this and had spent a long time wishing it were otherwise, because it was a difficult way to be. Your truest self most accessible in conditions that were also the hardest conditions. But it was what it was, and she had made a kind of peace with it that was less resignation than recognition. At 10:30, she went up to Harlan's room. He was dressed, sitting in the chair again, with his bag packed and Garrett standing by the door, with the expressions of someone who had been waiting and was glad the wait was over. She stood in the doorway. "You're in the chair," she said. "The chest tube is out," he said. "The chair is fine." "The chest tube has been out for 18 hours. "Correct." She walked in, checked him out of habit, his color, his breathing, the set of his posture, the absence of the particular tension that meant pain being suppressed. He looked good. Better than he had any right to look 4 days after a tension pneumothorax and a partial reaccumulation, which said something about either his constitution or his stubbornness, and probably both. "You're being discharged this morning," she said. "So they tell me. Follow up with your unit's medical officer within the week. Don't fly for 10 days. "I know. The residual tenderness is normal. If it sharpens or you develop any breathlessness at rest, that's not normal." "I know, Nora." She looked at him. He looked at her. "Faber called me this morning," he said, "about last night. I figured. You went to meet Brask alone. Faber was 20 minutes behind me." "Nora." "Reed." She let the name sit there. "It needed to be done. And it needed to be me who did it. You know why." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he exhaled, not with approval exactly, but with the specific acknowledgement of someone who understood a decision even while reserving the right to find it difficult. "The statement goes in today," he said. "Yes." "And then?" "And then it's a process. Months," Faber said. She looked at the window, at the Dorland morning, overcast, the mountains faintly visible at the edge of the cloud bank. "I'll be here. Working." "The hospital?" "Yes." After everything, I still have a job to do," she said. "The patients don't stop needing the bay because my record got corrected." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I keep thinking about the day I arrived. The flight medic said the nurse caught it. That a nurse pushed the surgeon to act." He paused. "They said it like it was an unusual thing, like a nurse seeing something a surgeon missed was remarkable. In some places it is. In the places you've worked," he said, "it was the baseline." She didn't have anything to say to that. It was true, and true things sometimes didn't need response. Garrett had been very diligently examining the wall during this conversation and was continuing to examine it. "Get on your flight," she said to Harlan. "Don't lift anything heavy for 2 weeks." He stood. I was slightly stiff, the residual kind, the kind that would work out in a few days, and he moved with the careful economy of someone managing a body that was technically cleared but still in dialogue with recent events. He picked up his bag. At the door he stopped. He turned and looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the corridor 4 nights ago, when he'd forced himself upright to say a thing worth spending energy on. This time he didn't say anything. He just looked at her for a moment, with the full weight of 6 years and 4 operators who were alive, and the specific look of a man who had been carrying a debt and was not done carrying it but felt differently about the carrying than he had a week ago. Then he nodded once. She nodded back. He left. The IG statement went in at 2 p.m. Nora was in the trauma bay when it happened and learned about it from a text from Faber that said only, "Done, complete, everything," which was the most Faber had ever used punctuation. The statement, she would learn later, was comprehensive in the way of documents written by people who had decided to stop holding things back. Brask named the program, the Congressional Inquiry, the chain of people who had wanted the embedded records quiet. He named 3 officers above his rank who had been in the room when the decision about the operational period's classification strategy was discussed. He provided dates, document numbers, meeting records. He confirmed that the KIA listing and the classification of Nora's record were connected and deliberate, and he confirmed his own role in maintaining both for 6 years after the fact. He also submitted the original handwritten Navy Cross recommendation, with a note that stated plainly that he had written it in full knowledge of what he was subsequently choosing to erase, and that the choice was his and the responsibility was his, and that neither the congressional inquiry nor the program nor the people above him removed his personal responsibility for the decision he had made in that room. It was not a perfect confession. There were places where the framing still protected him in ways that a harder accounting wouldn't have, and Nora knew that when she read it 3 days later, and she allowed herself to note it without letting it reduce the weight of what was actually there. People were not capable of perfect confession. The gap between what they'd done and what they could bring themselves to fully admit was a human constant, not a specific failure. What he'd given was, on balance, more than she had expected and more than he'd had to give, and she held that alongside the rest of it. The 3 officers named in the statement were notified of pending IG inquiry by the end of the week. 2 of them had already retired. One was still active, and his command was notified, and there were conversations above Faber's level that Faber relayed to her in summary rather than detail, which she appreciated. Mallory Kwan's cooperation was formally noted in the IG record. Her case would be reviewed separately, with her counsel present, and the outcome would take time. She had countersigned the order. That was a fact that wouldn't disappear. But the distinction between having signed it and having come forward with the original draft, that distinction was also now in the record, and it would matter in the way distinctions mattered when people decided what to do with documented facts. Marcus Veld's case moved through administrative review at Westhaven on a separate track. It was not a dramatic process. Institutional consequences rarely were, from the inside. What happened was that Faber's team completed their review of the 2 prior personnel actions involving staff who had contradicted Veld publicly, and the findings were presented to hospital administration, and administration made a decision. Veld was removed from his position as chief of trauma surgery. He was offered a surgical position in a non-leadership capacity at a different Westhaven facility, which he accepted. The announcement was made internally, in the specific institutional language that said something had happened without saying exactly what, and everyone who worked in the department understood what it meant, and nobody pretended they didn't. The day after the announcement, Bet stopped Nora in the corridor and said, "How do you feel about it?" Nora thought about it. "He was good at his job," she said. "He should have stayed good at it and not made it about something else." Bet looked at her. "That's all? What else should there be?" "I don't know. Satisfaction? Vindication?" "There's some of that," she said honestly. "Not a lot. Mostly, I'm just..." She thought about the word. Tired. Of the energy it takes to be in a room where someone thinks less of you than the situation requires. Bet nodded slowly. "Yeah," she said. "Me too." Drew Packard asked her 2 weeks later if she would be willing to give a case review presentation on the tension pneumothorax intervention, the timeline, the clinical reasoning, the indicators she had identified. "For the residents," he said. "As a teaching case." She said yes. She gave the presentation in the 3rd week of November, in the hospital's main education conference room, to 12 residents and 4 attending physicians, and Tamboli and Rosario and Bet, and a few others who had no official reason to be there but had come anyway. She did not talk about herself. She talked about the case, the patient, the presentation, the indicators that warranted intervention before imaging, the reasoning for each decision at each step. She talked about the things she had gotten wrong in her initial assessment and had to correct, because there had been things she'd gotten wrong, small ones, and eliding them would have made the presentation dishonest and therefore useless. At the end, a first-year resident raised her hand and asked, "How do you stay that calm when the room is pushing back on you?" Nora looked at her. She was young, mid-20s, the kind of bright-eyed specific seriousness that medical training put on people who had earned their place and knew it. "You don't, actually," Nora said. "You get good at doing the work while you're not calm. The work doesn't wait for calm." She paused. "What you're actually doing is deciding that the patient in front of you is more important than the discomfort of the room. That's not the same as being calm. It just looks the same from the outside." The resident nodded slowly. She wrote something in her notes. The Navy Cross presentation was held on the first Saturday of December in the hospital atrium. Not a ceremony, not exactly, though it had the bones of one. Captain Calloway flew in. Faber was there. Garrett Lowe came, in civilian clothes, without Harlan, who had sent a message through Garrett that said he would have been there if his medical officer had cleared him for the trip, and that he expected to be formally informed of every detail afterward, and that he was— Garrett paused when he relayed this part. Proud didn't cover it. Dominic Tran drove up from wherever he'd been. He was there early, standing near the back of the atrium with his hands in his jacket pockets, and the particular stillness of a man who had driven 14 hours once before for a thing that mattered and had not found it difficult to do it again. Bet was there. Rosario. Drew Packard, who stood in the back and was quiet in the way of someone carrying the specific weight of recalibration that had not fully resolved but was moving in a direction. Several nurses from the floor whose names Nora had learned carefully and whose competence she had been watching and cataloging for the weeks since the review. Grundle was there, which Nora had not expected. Calloway gave a brief statement. Not long, not theatrical, because Nora had asked for not long and not theatrical, and Calloway had respected that with the ease of someone who understood that the presentation was for the person receiving it and not for the room. She read the citation. The original citation, the handwritten one, transcribed into the official format and entered into the public record. She named the Makar Valley operation without detail. Some of the operational specifics remained classified and would for some time. But she named what Nora had done, and she named the hours it had taken, and she named the outcome in the plain language of documented fact. 4 operators survived. 7 personnel total, 12 hours, under fire. When Calloway pinned the medal, the room was quiet in the way rooms were quiet when something happened that was too real for noise. Nora stood in the hospital atrium in her nursing scrubs. She had considered wearing something else, and then decided she was not going to wear something else, because this was who she was and where she worked, and scrubs were the accurate representation of both. And she let Calloway pin the medal, and she looked at it for a moment, this small, heavy thing that had existed in a locked file for 6 years and was now exactly where it was supposed to be, and she felt the weight of it, and the strange reality of it, and the complicated human mixture of things she could not entirely name. She looked at the room, at Dominic in the back, at Bet's expression, which had abandoned professional neutrality entirely and was just the face of a person who was moved, at the first-year resident from her presentation, who had apparently heard about this and come, and whose expression had a quality that Nora recognized as the specific look of someone recategorizing what was possible. She said a few words. Not many. She was not built for speeches, and she did not want to perform something that the moment didn't require. She said that the medal represented things that had been true, regardless of whether the record said so, and that the correction of the record mattered not because it changed the events, but because records were what institutions used to see people, and people deserved to be seen accurately. She said that the work she had done in the Makar Valley and the work she had done in this building were not different kinds of work. They were the same work, the same fundamental act of showing up to a situation that needed someone and making the best decision available with the information and time and tools on hand. She said that the people in this room who did that every day without medals or citations or press releases were doing the same thing. She said that was the part she wanted them to remember. Then she said thank you, briefly and genuinely, and the room responded in the particular way rooms responded when something had been said that was actual rather than performed, and that was that. Afterward, in the atrium, Dominic found her. "She's going to love hearing about this someday," he said. "Your daughter." "Yeah." He looked at the medal on her scrubs. "When she's old enough. I'll tell her the whole thing." Nora looked at him. Tell her it was messy, she said. Tell her it took longer than it should have, and the people involved were imperfect, including me. Tell her that's how it usually goes, and that going that way doesn't make it less worth doing. He nodded. She'll like that version better anyway. Kids usually do, she said. The true one. He left, and Calloway came to say goodbye, and Faber shook her hand with the same professional economy he brought to everything, and Garrett gave her a salute that was technically informal and completely genuine, and Grundle said something careful, and she responded to it carefully, and then gradually the atrium emptied back into the hospital's ordinary operations, which did not pause for medals or presentations or the correction of 6-year-old records. The patients were still there. The work was still there. She stood in the atrium after most of the room had cleared, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold while the presentation was happening, looking at the hospital around her, the movement of it, the particular busyness of a level 1 trauma center on a Saturday morning, the nurses crossing the lobby with the focused economy of people who knew where they were going and why, the family in the corner chairs waiting for news they were trying not to show they were afraid of, the resident near the elevator reviewing something on her tablet with the intensity of someone who was not done learning and knew it. She had come to this city to be quiet. She had come here to stop being seen and to do the work in the background of other people's priorities, to take up less space than she actually required, to be manageable and unremarkable and left alone. What she had found instead was a place where the work mattered anyway, where the patients were real regardless of whether her record was, where a teenager had followed her breathing and an elderly man's infection had been caught and a construction worker's head lac had been properly assessed and a SEAL colonel's lung had been reinflated in time because she had been standing in the room and had been unwilling to stay quiet. She had not been quiet because she had built herself out of a specific decision, that the person in front of her would always cost more than her own comfort. That had been true in a valley in the dark, and it was true in this atrium, and it was true on the floor above her where her shift would start in 3 hours and she would do it again. The same decision, the same waiting, until the day she couldn't. The medal was real. The record was corrected. The name on the KIA list had been removed and replaced with the accurate thing, and the people who had put it there were in the process of accounting for it in the ways that institutions accounted for things. Slowly, imperfectly, with the friction of processes that existed for reasons both good and bureaucratic. None of that had made her what she was. She had already been that thing. She had been it in the valley, and she had been it in the parking lot, and she had been it in the trauma bay with shaking hands and no record that anyone could see. The record catching up to the fact was not the creation of the fact. It was just the world finally bothering to look. She drank the cold coffee because it was there, and she was a person who finished things. Then she put the cup down, straightened the metal on her scrubs. It sat a little heavy, a little unfamiliar, and she thought she might not wear it every day, but she would wear it today. And she went back to work. Not because she had something to prove. That part was done. Because there were people in this building who needed someone in the room who would not stay quiet, and she was that person. And she had decided a long time ago that being that person was the thing she was going to be. Whatever name they put on the record, whatever room she was standing in, that was the part that had always been hers.